The rope creaked against the gallows beam, swaying in the bitter Montana wind. Samuel Hawkins stood with his head bowed, gray hair whipping across his weathered face. At 73, the former blacksmith's once powerful shoulders now stooped beneath the weight of his final moments. The noose hung loose around his neck for now. Sheriff Wallace adjusted his badge, avoiding the old man's eyes. A crowd had gathered in Coyote Creek's dusty main street, their faces hard as the Montana winter. Some looked away. Others stared with the grim satisfaction of those who believe justice is being served. Victor Blackwood watched from his black stallion, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the frontier setting. His silver-tipped cane rested against his saddle, and a smile cold as a January morning played at the corners of his mouth. "Samuel Hawkins," Wallace announced, voice cracking slightly, "you've been found guilty of horse theft from the property of Mr. Victor Blackwood. The sentence is death by hanging. May God have mercy on your soul." The old man lifted his chin. "I ain't stole nothing in my life. Not a horse, not a cent." His voice carried clear across the street. "The Lord knows it, and Blackwood knows it too." Blackwood's smile never faltered. At the edge of the crowd, Mason Reed watched through narrowed eyes. His hand rested near the worn Colt revolver on his hip, fingers tapping an uneasy rhythm against the leather holster. The wind tugged at his battered hat, and the edges of his long coat revealing glimpses of the jagged scar that ran from his left eye to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from Shiloh, folks whispered, though Mason never spoke of it. He'd ridden into town for nails and coffee, not to witness a hanging. But as Sheriff Wallace reached for the lever that would drop the trapdoor, Mason recognized the farce for what it was. He'd seen enough mock trials in his days as a lawman to know when justice had been sacrificed on the altar of power. Samuel Hawkins had mended Mason's plow just last spring, charged him fair, looked him in the eye when they spoke. The old blacksmith wouldn't steal so much as a horseshoe nail, let alone a prize stallion. The lever creaked as Wallace gripped it. The crowd held its breath. Mason's Colt cleared leather before he'd made a conscious decision. The shot cracked through the morning air, and the rope snapped above Hawkins' head, frayed ends whipping in the wind. Chaos erupted instantly. Women screamed, men ducked for cover. Sheriff Wallace stumbled backward, hand fumbling for his gun. Blackwood's horse reared, nearly unseating him. Mason moved swiftly through the confusion, a second shot into the air, clearing his path to the gallows. He reached Samuel, cutting the binding ropes with a quick slash of his hunting knife. "Run for the livery," Mason muttered. "My horse is there, the sorrel gelding. Head north to Ezra's place." Samuel's eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with determination. He nodded once and slipped away through the mayhem. Mason turned, gun raised, to find himself facing 5 of Blackwood's men, weapons drawn. Behind them, Blackwood had regained control of his horse and was watching with cold fury. "Drop it, Reed," commanded Jedediah Parker, Blackwood's lead gunman. Tall and lean with dead eyes, Parker wore his reputation like the twin Remingtons on his hips, with practiced ease and deadly intent. Mason held his ground. That was no trial. That was murder wearing a judge's robe. "The law found him guilty," Parker sneered. "The law?" Mason's laugh was bitter as creek water in December. "There's no law in Coyote Creek except what Blackwood buys and pays for." The standoff might have ended in bloodshed then and there, but Sheriff Wallace stepped between them, hands raised. "Enough, Parker, lower those guns." "Reed," Wallace's voice dropped. "You've made your point. Now get out of my town before I have to arrest you." Mason held Parker's gaze a moment longer, then slowly holstered his weapon. "Your town, Wallace. We both know whose town this really is." As he turned to leave, movement behind the church caught his eye. In the sudden silence following the chaos, he heard the soft clink of chains and a muffled sob. Mason altered course, ignoring Wallace's warning shout. Behind the white steepled church, partially hidden from the main street, he found her. A girl no more than 13, chained to an iron post driven into the hard Montana earth. Her dress was torn and dirty, dark hair falling in tangles over her face. But when she looked up, Mason felt a jolt of recognition, not of her face, but of something in her eyes. They were gray as wood smoke, hard as steel, and carried the same haunted determination he'd seen in young soldiers' eyes during the war. The eyes of someone who had lost everything but refused to surrender. "What in God's name is this?" Mason demanded, turning back toward the crowd that had followed him. Jedediah Parker stepped forward, a smile spreading across his face like oil on water. That there's Blackwood property, legal and proper. She's a child. She's payment for debt, Parker corrected. Her pa, Thomas Emerson, lost more than money at the card table. Lost his claim to his daughter, too. Signed the papers himself. The girl's chin lifted at the mention of her father, a flash of something hurt, anger, betrayal crossing her face before the mask of defiance returned. Mason knelt before her, keeping his voice low. "What's your name, child?" For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, then Sarah Emerson. Her voice was rough, as though she hadn't used it in days, but there was strength in it. "You being held against your will, Sarah." A small, bitter smile. "What do you think, Mr. Mason?" stood, turning to face Parker in the growing crowd. "How much?" Parker's eyebrows rose. "She ain't for sale. She's Mr. Blackwood's property now, too. Everything has a price in Coyote Creek." Mason pulled a leather pouch from inside his coat. $18, gold. A murmur ran through the onlookers. It was a considerable sum, nearly 3 months' wages for a ranch hand. Blackwood had dismounted and now approached each tap of his cane, punctuating the silence. "Interesting," he said, voice smooth as aged whiskey. "First you interfere with justice, now you attempt to purchase what's legally mine." He studied Mason as one might study an unusual insect. "What's your interest in the girl, Reed?" "My interest is in not seeing children sold like cattle." Mason held the pouch out. $18. Take it or leave it. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. "Oh, I'll take it." He nodded to Parker, who snatched the pouch from Mason's hand. "Consider it a down payment on the trouble you've bought yourself today." Parker tossed a rusted key to Mason, who caught it one-handed. As Mason knelt to unlock Sarah's chains, Blackwood leaned in close. "You were a lawman once," he whispered, voice pitched for Mason's ears alone. "You should know better than most. Some debts can't be paid in gold." Mason said nothing, focusing on the lock. When it finally clicked open, Sarah rubbed her raw wrists but made no move to stand. "Come on," Mason said gently. "We're leaving." She eyed him warily. "To where?" "Somewhere safe." Sarah's laugh was too old for her years. "Ain't no such place." "Maybe not," Mason conceded, "but my ranch is safer than here." He offered his hand. After a long moment, she took it. As they walked toward the livery, the crowd parted silently. Mason felt their eyes, some sympathetic, some curious, some hostile. Most looked away when he met their gaze. Sheriff Wallace stood with his hat in his hands, something like shame written across his features. At the livery stable, Mason found his sorrel gelding gone. Samuel had taken his advice. Instead, he saddled his pack mule for Sarah and a borrowed mare for himself, paying the livery owner extra for the trouble. As they rode out of town, Blackwood's voice followed them. "Enjoy your purchase, Reed. I'll be collecting the balance due." "With interest." They rode north in silence, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah sat stiffly atop the mule, eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the trail behind them, Mason himself. She kept one hand closed tightly around something hidden in the pocket of her tattered dress. The Montana plains stretched endless around them, tall grasses bowing in the wind. To the west, the jagged peaks of distant mountains carved a rough edge against the vast blue sky. It was beautiful country, Mason thought, when it wasn't trying to kill you with blizzards, drought, or the occasional mountain lion. After an hour, he broke the silence. "You hungry?" Sarah shrugged one shoulder but didn't answer. Mason reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of jerky, offering it to her. She eyed it suspiciously before taking it with fingers that trembled slightly. She didn't eat it immediately, instead tucking it into her pocket. "It's not poison," Mason said. "And you don't need to save it. There's more where that came from." Sarah's eyes flicked to his face, then away. "You don't know about needing to save things," she muttered. The words hit with unexpected force. Mason fell silent, recognizing the truth in them. After all, wasn't that why he'd intervened? Some hurts you couldn't save yourself from, no matter how carefully you planned. It was late afternoon when Lone Pine Ranch came into view. The name had been Elizabeth's idea, inspired by the solitary ponderosa pine that stood sentinel on the ridge above the homestead. The tree was visible for miles, a lone figure against the sky. The ranch itself was modest, a sturdy cabin built of hand-hewn logs, a barn that leaned slightly to the north, a corral with split-rail fencing, and a chicken coop. Not much, but it was more than most had in this part of Montana. Sarah surveyed it with practiced indifference, but Mason caught the way her eyes lingered on the smoke curling from the chimney, the clothesline strung between two posts, the small garden patch beside the cabin. Signs of home. "This is it," he said, dismounting. "Lone pine." Sarah slid carefully from the mule's back, wincing slightly as her feet touched ground. Mason pretended not to notice as he led both animals to the corral. "The cabin's unlocked," he called over his shoulder. "Go on in if you want." She didn't move, watching him warily. "What do you want from me?" Mason paused in unsaddling the mule. The question hung between them, simple and devastating in its implications. He chose his words carefully. "Nothing," he said finally. "I want nothing from you except maybe that you get enough to eat and sleep somewhere safe until we figure out what's next." "Why?" Suspicion edged her voice. Mason resumed his work, not meeting her eyes. "Because it was the right thing to do." "Ain't nobody does the right thing just because it's right," Sarah said flatly. "Especially not for strangers." Mason had no answer for that, not one she'd believe anyway, so he simply continued unsaddling the animals, giving her space to decide for herself. Eventually, her hunger or curiosity won out. By the time Mason had finished with the horses and carried their saddlebags to the cabin, Sarah was standing just inside the door, taking inventory of her surroundings. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table with 3 chairs stood in the center of the main room. A curtain partitioned off a sleeping area, and shelves lined the walls holding books, tools, and provisions. Everything was neat, orderly, but with a layer of dust that spoke of a man who lived alone and spent more time outdoors than in. Sarah's attention fixed on something Mason couldn't see. When he followed her gaze, he found she was staring at the mantelpiece where a single photograph in a wooden frame stood. Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The photograph showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile holding a small boy of perhaps 4 years. Elizabeth and Michael, his wife and son, both long dead now, their bones resting beneath the lone pine on the ridge. "That's your family?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Mason set the saddlebags down. "Yes." "Where are they?" "Gone." The word came out harsher than he intended. He softened his tone. "There's a stew pot on the stove. Should still be warm. Help yourself." Sarah hesitated, then moved toward the cast iron stove. Mason busied himself unpacking, giving her privacy to eat. The evening settled around them with the awkward silence of strangers forced into proximity. Mason showed Sarah where she would sleep, a small trundle bed in the corner of the main room, while he would take the partitioned sleeping area. He gave her one of Elizabeth's old nightgowns, long stored in a cedar chest. It was far too large, but cleaner than the dress she wore. "There's soap and water in the basin if you want to wash," he said. "I'll be outside checking on the animals. Take your time." When he returned later, Sarah was curled on the trundle bed facing the wall. The nightgown swallowed her small frame, making her look even younger than she was. Her dirty dress hung on a peg by the door, and Mason noted she'd washed her face and hands. He moved quietly, banking the fire for the night. As he turned to go to his own bed, Sarah's voice stopped him. "Why'd you really buy me?" Mason paused. "I told you, it was the right thing." "You said you weren't buying me," she countered. "Said you were buying my freedom." "That's right." Sarah rolled over, fixing him with those storm gray eyes. "Ain't no such thing as freedom that can be bought and sold, mister. If it can be taken away, it wasn't really yours to begin with." The wisdom in her words and the bitterness behind them left Mason speechless. He nodded once in acknowledgement and retreated behind his curtain. Sleep was long in coming. Mason lay awake listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the creak of the cabin, settling, the occasional stamp of a horse in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote. Through the thin curtain, he could hear Sarah's breathing, too measured and regular for sleep. She was lying awake, too vigilant in strange surroundings. It was in the darkest part of night when the nightmare took him. It always began the same way, with smoke, thick, choking smoke filling his lungs as he raced toward the burning cabin. Elizabeth's screams, Michael's cries, the crack of gunfire, the smell of burning flesh. "Elizabeth!" The name tore from his throat as Mason bolted upright, sweat-soaked and trembling. "Michael." For a moment, the dream and reality blurred. Then the familiar shadows of his cabin took shape around him, and the crushing weight of memory settled back into place. A floorboard creaked. Mason's hand went automatically to the revolver he kept beside his bed. "You were shouting." Sarah's voice came from beyond the curtain, wary but not afraid. Mason exhaled slowly, willing his racing heart to calm. "I'm sorry if I woke you." A pause. "You didn't." "I was already awake." Of course she was. Trust wasn't built in a day, especially not for a child who'd been traded away by her own father. "Go back to bed, Sarah. Everything's fine." Another pause. "You called for Elizabeth and Michael. That them in the picture?" Mason's throat tightened. "Yes." "What happened to them?" "They died." He couldn't bring himself to say more. "Not now, maybe not ever." Sarah seemed to accept this. The floorboards creaked again as she retreated to her bed. Neither of them slept much for what remained of the night. Morning brought a semblance of routine. Mason rose early, built up the fire, and put coffee on to boil. Sarah emerged from her bed with cautious movements, as though testing whether the rules had changed overnight. "There's cornmeal mush on the stove," Mason said by way of greeting. "Help yourself." She did, but he noticed she took only a small portion, eating it slowly, methodically, as though making it last. When she thought he wasn't looking, she slipped a chunk of bread into the pocket of her freshly washed dress. "You don't need to hide food," Mason said quietly. "There's plenty." Sarah froze, caught in the act. Then her chin came up defiantly. "For now, maybe." Mason nodded, understanding. "For now and for later. I give you my word." She studied him, weighing his promise against whatever experiences had taught her to distrust a man's word. Finally, she gave a small nod, though she didn't remove the bread from her pocket. After breakfast, Mason outlined the day ahead. "I need to mend the north fence line. You can stay here if you want, or come along, your choice." Sarah glanced around the cabin, then back at Mason. "I'll come." He suspected it wasn't companionship she sought, but rather the security of keeping him in sight, of knowing where the potential threat was at all times. He didn't blame her. They worked through the morning, Mason repairing broken fence rails, while Sarah held nails or fetched tools. She was quick and capable, following directions with a precision that suggested she was no stranger to hard work. Around midday, they paused to eat the lunch Mason had packed, more bread, cheese, and strips of dried venison. Sarah ate with slightly less caution than at breakfast. "Your pa teach you to work like that?" Mason asked, breaking the companionable silence that had developed. Sarah's expression shuddered. "Pa taught me lots of things." "He a rancher?" "Was?" She tore a piece of bread in half with more force than necessary. "Had a small spread southeast of here. Nothing fancy." "What happened?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "Blackwood happened." Mason waited, giving her space to continue or not, as she chose. "Pa got in debt during the bad winter 2 years back," she said finally. "Needed money for feed medicine for the stock. Blackwood offered loans." Her mouth twisted bitterly, didn't mention the interest until it was too late. A familiar story in these parts. Blackwood had built his empire on the broken backs of desperate men. "That doesn't explain how you ended up." Mason couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Sarah did it for him. Chained like a mom, she shrugged, the casualness of the gesture betrayed by the tension in her shoulders. "Pa took to gambling, trying to win enough to pay Blackwood back. Kept losing instead." Her voice dropped. "Last week he lost me." The simple statement hung in the air between them, its horror undiminished by her matter-of-fact delivery. "No man has the right to wager his child." Mason said the words tight with controlled anger. Sarah looked at him, then really looked at him, as though seeing him clearly for the first time. "Lots of things happen that ain't right, Mr. Reed. Don't make them any less real." They finished their work in silence, the weight of Sarah's words settling over them like an early frost. The days that followed established a tenuous rhythm. Sarah gradually expanded her territory, venturing from the cabin to explore the barn, the chicken coop, the garden. Mason noticed she checked and rechecked potential escape routes, hiding places, anything that might serve as a weapon in need. She was planning, always planning, for the moment when safety would once again be stripped away. On the third evening, Mason found her examining the lone pine on the ridge. Beneath it, 2 wooden crosses stood sentinel against the endless Montana sky. Mason had carved them himself, each letter of their names a wound reopened. Sarah glanced back as he approached, neither apologetic nor defiant. Simply waiting. "My wife and son," Mason said, answering the unasked question. 5 years ago now." Sarah looked back at the crosses weathered by sun and snow and time. What happened to them? Mason had told the story exactly once to the circuit judge who'd ruled the deaths accidental, despite the evidence Mason had presented. After that, he'd locked the words away with his badge and his faith in justice. But standing there with his child who had seen too much of the world's cruelty, he found the lock giving way. Fire, he said. I was in town serving as deputy marshal back then. Someone set our cabin ablaze while Elizabeth and Michael were inside. His voice roughened. By the time I got here, the roof had collapsed. There was nothing I could do. Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then, you know who did it? Mason's jaw tightened. I had my suspicions. No proof the judge would accept. Blackwood, she guessed. Mason's silence was answer enough. Sarah nodded, a child understanding, a truth no child should have to comprehend. That why you helped me because of them? Maybe, Mason admitted. Or maybe because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing. They stood together as the sun slipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. When darkness began to fall, they walked back to the cabin side by side, not touching, but somehow less alone than before. That night, Sarah's nightmares were the ones that shattered the silence. Mason woke to the sound of muffled cries and thrashing. He approached her bed cautiously, keeping his distance. Sarah, he called softly. Sarah, wake up. You're safe. She came awake with a gasp, eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him or her surroundings. Then awareness returned, and with it the walls she'd built around herself. I'm fine, she said, though her voice trembled. Just a dream. Mason nodded, not pushing. Would you like some water? She shook her head. All right, try to get some rest. He turned to go. Mr. Reed, he paused. Mason, call me Mason. The hesitation. Mason, do you still have nightmares about them? The question cut to the quick, honest, in a way adults rarely managed. Yes, he answered truthfully. Not every night anymore, but often enough. Sarah nodded, processing this. Does it ever stop hurting? Mason considered lying, offering the comfort of false hope, but she deserved better than that. No, he said gently, but you learn to carry it. It becomes part of who you are, not all of who you are. She absorbed this, then lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Good night, Mason. Good night, Sarah. The following morning, Mason decided it was time Sarah learned to defend herself. He took her to a clearing behind the barn and placed his old Colt revolver in her hands. It's heavy, she said, surprised. Yes, and dangerous, which is why you need to learn to handle it properly. He showed her how to check if it was loaded, how to aim, how to account for the kick when firing. Sarah listened intently, absorbing every detail. This isn't about hurting people, Mason emphasized. It's about protecting yourself if there's no other choice. Sarah's expression was solemn. I understand. They practiced with tin cans set on fence posts. Sarah's first shots went wild, but she was a quick study. By the end of the hour, she was hitting her target more often than not. Good, Mason said, genuinely impressed. You have got a steady hand. A flicker of pride crossed Sarah's face before she could suppress it. Pa taught me to shoot a rifle once, before she broke off. Before things got bad, Mason suggested gently. Sarah nodded, her momentary openness closing like a door against a storm. They were returning to the cabin when they saw the rider approaching from the east. Mason instinctively positioned himself between Sarah and the newcomer, hand resting near his holster. As the rider drew closer, tension drained from Mason's shoulders. It's all right, he told Sarah. That's Ezra Sullivan, my nearest neighbor. Ezra Sullivan was well into his 70s with a white beard that reached the middle of his chest and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He rode a sturdy pinto mare that looked as ancient as he was. Mason Reed, he called as he approached. Heard you'd gotten yourself in a bit of trouble in town. Mason smiled wryly. News travels fast. Bad news travels fastest of all. Ezra dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such activity. His sharp eyes took in Sarah standing slightly behind Mason. And who might this young lady be? Sarah Emerson, Mason said. She's staying with me for a while. Ezra's bushy eyebrows rose, but he simply tipped his hat to Sarah. Miss Emerson, pleasure to make your acquaintance. Sarah nodded cautiously, studying the old man. Come inside, Ezra, Mason invited. I'll put on some coffee. In the cabin, Ezra settled at the table while Mason prepared coffee. Sarah perched on the edge of a chair, alert and watchful. So, Ezra said once they were all seated, I reckon you've ruffled some mighty important feathers, Mason. Blackwood's, Mason acknowledged. Ezra sipped his coffee. Word in town is you stole his property. His eyes flicked to Sarah. I paid fair and square, Mason said, voice hardening, and Sarah isn't property. Ezra nodded approvingly. Didn't think you'd see it any other way. He turned to Sarah. No offense intended, Miss Emerson, just reporting what's being said. Sarah shrugged. Truth is truth. Blackwood thinks he owns me. Well, Victor Blackwood thinks he owns half the territory. Ezra snorted. Don't make it, Chiwitu. How bad is it? Mason asked, returning to the matter at hand. Ezra's expression sobered. Bad enough. Blackwood's offering a reward for information on your whereabouts. $20 more than he paid for old Samuel's life. Samuel got away all right. Made it to my place just like you told him. I sent him on to my cousins in Helena. He'll be safe there. Mason nodded his relief. Good. But that's not the worst of it. Ezra leaned forward. Blackwood's been meeting with Sheriff Wallace and Judge Harding. A lot of talk about legal ownership and theft of property. A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. They're building a case. Appears so. Blackwood's got papers with Thomas Emerson's signature on them. Ezra's gaze moved to Sarah. Sorry, child. I know that's hard to hear. Sarah's face had gone blank, that careful mask of indifference sliding into place. Like I said, truth is truth. Ezra studied her for a moment, then turned back to Mason. There's something else you should know. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah again. Mason understood. Sarah, would you mind collecting eggs from the hen house I forgot to this morning? The girl clearly recognized the dismissal for what it was, but she rose without protest and left the cabin. Once the door closed behind her, Ezra lowered his voice. It's about the girl's mother. Mason frowned. I assumed she was dead. That's what most folks think. What Blackwood wants them to think. Ezra stroked his beard. But there are rumors, whispers that Rebecca Emerson didn't die of fever 3 years back. That she escaped from Blackwood's ranch in the night and has been hiding out near Widow's Peak. Mason stared at his old friend. You're certain? Nothing's certain in this life except death and taxes, Ezra hedged. But my sources are usually reliable. Does Sarah know? I doubt it. Blackwood would have made sure she believed her ma was dead. Easier to control someone who thinks they've got nowhere else to go. Mason's mind raced with the implications. Why are you telling me this, Ezra? The old man's eyes, faded with age but still sharp, held Mason's gaze. Because that girl deserves to know her ma might be alive. And because you need to understand what you're really up against. Blackwood, Mason said grimly. Not just Blackwood, Ezra corrected. The whole system he's built. The law, the banks, the businesses, he's got his fingers in all of it. He leaned back in his chair. You were a lawman once, Mason. You know how this works. Men like Blackwood don't need to break the law when they can bend it to serve them. Mason did know. It was why he turned in his badge after the judge dismissed his evidence against Blackwood. What was the point of upholding the law when justice could be purchased at like a pound of sugar? What would you have me do? Mason asked. Hand Sarah back to him. Hell no, Ezra said emphatically. I'm just saying, be prepared. Blackwood won't let this go, not because he cares about the girl, but because you've challenged him publicly. His kind can't abide that. They were interrupted by Sarah's return, a small basket of eggs in her hands. Her eyes moved between the two men, assessing, calculating. Fresh eggs, she announced, setting the basket on the table. The speckled hen was fussy about giving hers up. She always is, Mason said, grateful for the change of subject. Thank you, Sarah. Ezra finished his coffee and stood. Well, I'd best be getting back. Got chores waiting. He settled his hat on his head. Good to meet you, Miss Emerson. You're in good hands with Mason here. Sarah's expression suggested she was reserving judgment on that score. As Mason walked Ezra to his horse, the old man gripped his arm. One more thing, he said quietly. There's talk that Blackwood and Thomas Emerson had some kind of falling out before the card game. Something about Emerson finding out things he shouldn't have. What kind of things? Ezra shook his head. Don't know, but whatever it was, it might explain why Blackwood was so keen to get his hands on the girl. Mason's jaw tightened. Revenge. Or insurance, Ezra suggested. Either way, watch your back. He mounted his horse with a grunt of effort. And Mason, consider taking the girl to find her mother. Might be the safest place for both of you is far from here. With that, he turned his pinto and rode away, leaving Mason with more questions than answers. That night, as Sarah helped prepare dinner, Mason considered how to broach the subject of her mother. The girl had just begun to trust him in her cautious way. What if Ezra's information was wrong? What if he gave her hope only to have it crushed again? In the end, Sarah made the decision for him. What did Ezra tell you? She asked bluntly as they sat down to eat. About me, I mean. Mason blinked at her directness. What makes you think he told me anything about you, Us? Sarah gave him a look that suggested she found his evasion tiresome. You sent me out for eggs right after he mentioned my pa's signature on those papers. Wasn't hard to figure. Mason conceded the point with a nod. She was observant, this child. Too observant for her own peace of mind, perhaps. He told me there are rumors your mother might be alive. Sarah went very still, her spoon suspended halfway to her mouth. Ma's dead, she said flatly. Fever took her 3 winters ago. Pa buried her himself. Are you sure about that? Mason asked gently. Did you see her body? Sarah's hand began to tremble slightly. She set the spoon down. Pa wouldn't lie about that. Maybe he believed it too, Mason suggested. Or maybe he had reasons to let you think it was true. Like what? Anger sparked in her eyes now, the first real emotion she'd shown beyond fear and caution. Protection, maybe? Ezra thinks your mother might have escaped from Blackwood's ranch and gone into hiding. Sarah pushed away from the table chair legs, scraping harshly against the wooden floor. That's a lie. My ma would never leave me. Never. Sarah, no. The word burst from her with surprising force. My ma is dead. She's dead and my brother's dead, and my pa might as well be dead for all he cares about me now. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. Don't you tell me my ma's alive somewhere, living fine and free, while I was, she couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, she bolted for the door, flinging it open and disappearing into the gathering dusk. Mason swore under his breath and went after her. He found her at the lone pine curled at the base of the tree, knees drawn up to her chest. He approached slowly, giving her time to collect herself. I'm sorry, he said, settling on the ground a respectful distance away. I shouldn't have sprung that on you like that. Sarah didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. It's not true. Maybe not, Mason conceded. Ezra deals in rumors and possibilities. He could be wrong. He is wrong. Mason let the silence stretch between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine needles and the distant cry of a nighthawk. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice small but steady. I had a brother, William. He was 2 years younger than me. Mason waited, sensing there was more to come. Last winter, Blackwood's men came to collect the debt. Pa couldn't pay. He begged for more time. Sarah swallowed hard. They took Will instead. Said Pa could have him back when the debt was paid. A cold knot formed in Mason's stomach. What happened? Pa worked himself half to death, took odd jobs, sold almost everything we had, finally got enough to pay what he owed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But when he went to get Will back, Blackwood said there had been an accident, said Will had fallen from a horse, broken his neck. Mason closed his eyes briefly, a wave of helpless rage washing over him. I'm sorry, Sarah. Pa changed after that. She continued as though she hadn't heard him. Started drinking, gambling. It was like he didn't care about anything anymore. Not the ranch, not me. Her voice cracked on the last word. Mason risked moving closer, though he didn't touch her. Your father failed you, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean everyone will. Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. You can't promise that. No, Mason agreed. I can't. But I can promise that while you're with me, I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against her experiences. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out what she'd been keeping hidden there, a tarnished silver pendant on a broken chain. A sunburst design was etched into its surface. This was my ma's, she said. Pa gave it to me after she died. Said it was all he had left of her. Mason looked at the pendant but didn't reach for it. This was Sarah's treasure, perhaps her only tangible connection to her mother. It's beautiful, he said simply. Sarah closed her fingers around it, holding it tight. If Ma was alive, she'd have come back for me. Mason had no answer for that. They sat together as darkness fell completely, each lost in their own thoughts, until the night grew too cold to remain outside. As they walked back to the cabin, Sarah asked, "You really think she might be alive?" "I think it's possible," Mason said carefully. "And if there's even a chance, don't you want to know for sure?" Sarah considered this, her face solemn in the moonlight. "Yeah," she said finally. "I want to know." Morning brought a rare sight to Lone Pine Ranch visitors. Mason was chopping wood when he spotted the wagon approaching a woman at the reins. He set down his axe and called to Sarah, who was feeding the chickens nearby. "Stay close to the cabin," he instructed, hand dropping to his holster out of habit. As the wagon drew nearer, he recognized Abigail Winters, a widow who lived several miles to the south. She was in her 60s with iron gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and a no-nonsense demeanor that had intimidated generations of school children when she taught at the Coyote Creek schoolhouse. "Mason Reed," she called as she brought the wagon to a halt. "I heard you'd taken in a stray." Mason relaxed slightly. Abigail was opinionated and blunt to a fault, but she was also fair-minded and had no love for Victor Blackwood, who'd foreclosed on her late husband's sawmill. "Mrs. Winters," he greeted her. "What brings you out this way?" "Curiosity mostly," she admitted, climbing down from the wagon with practiced ease. Her sharp eyes found Sarah, who had edged closer despite Mason's instruction to stay back. "And you must be the girl everyone's talking about." Sarah stiffened but held her ground. "I got a name." "I'm sure you do, child. Care to share it?" "Sarah Emerson." Abigail nodded as though confirming something to herself. "Rebecca's girl, then? I thought as much. You have her eyes." Sarah's composure faltered. "You knew my mother." "I taught her to read, same as I taught half the children in this territory." Abigail turned to Mason. "Is there coffee on? These old bones don't take to travel like they used to." Inside the cabin, Abigail settled at the table while Mason prepared coffee, and Sarah hovered uncertainly, clearly torn between curiosity about her mother and ingrained wariness of strangers. "I brought provisions," Abigail announced. "Bread, preserves, some of last fall's apples. They're in the wagon." "That's kind of you," Mason said, surprised. Abigail waved a dismissive hand. "Not kindness, common sense. You've kicked the hornet's nest, Mason Reed. Least I can do is make sure you are well fed while dealing with the stings." Sarah had been studying Abigail intently. Now she burst out with the question she'd clearly been holding back. "Was my ma really your student?" "She was Chaim," Abigail confirmed. "Bright girl, quick with figures. Had a talent for drawing too." Her expression softened slightly. "She was proud as punch when you were born, Sarah. Brought you to the schoolhouse when you were just a few weeks old to show you off." Something like hunger crossed Sarah's face. Hunger for information, for connection to the mother she'd lost. "What else do you remember about her?" Abigail sipped her coffee. She was stubborn, had opinions, and wasn't shy about sharing them. And loyal, fiercely loyal to those she cared about. She set her cup down, "Which is why I never believed she'd leave her children willingly." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Ezra said there are rumors she might be alive," Mason said carefully, "that she escaped from Blackwood's ranch." Abigail's mouth tightened. "Rumors, yes, I've heard them too, can't say if they're true." She turned to Sarah. "But I will say this, your mother would move heaven and earth to get back to you if she could." Sarah's hand moved to her pocket, where Mason knew she kept the silver pendant. "Pa said she died of fever." "That's what Thomas told everyone," Abigail acknowledged. "But there were inconsistencies in his story, dates that didn't align, details that changed with each telling." She shook her head. "I always wondered if he was protecting someone or himself." Mason leaned forward. "What do you know about Thomas Emerson's relationship with Blackwood? Before the debt, I mean." "They had history," Abigail said carefully. "Years back, Thomas worked for Blackwood for a time, managing one of his smallest ranches, left under something of a cloud." She frowned. "There were whispers that Thomas had discovered something he shouldn't have. Nothing concrete, mind you, but enough smoke to suggest fire." It aligned with what Ezra had told him. Mason exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was absorbing every word with intense concentration. "Mrs. Winters," he said, "do you believe the rumors about Rebecca being alive?" Abigail was silent for a long moment, considering. "I believe Rebecca Emerson had more spine than most men I've known," she said finally. "And I believe Victor Blackwood is capable of almost anything to protect his interests." She looked directly at Sarah. "If your mother could find a way to survive an escaped child, she would have taken it." Sarah's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Then why didn't she come back for me?" The question hung in the air, heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Perhaps she couldn't," Abigail suggested gently. "Perhaps she tried and was prevented. Or perhaps she believed you were safer where you were until recently." Mason thought of the timing, Sarah being wagered away just a week ago after years of living with her father following her mother's supposed death. It seemed too coincidental. "We're considering trying to find her," he said. "Ezra mentioned Widow's Peak." Abigail nodded slowly. "It would be a dangerous journey. That's rough country, and Blackwood has eyes everywhere." She hesitated. "But if you're determined, I may be able to help. I have a map of the old trails that don't appear on most charts. Paths the prospectors used before the big strikes played out." "That would be invaluable," Mason said. "I'll bring it tomorrow," Abigail promised, rising from her chair. "And Mason, be careful who you trust. Blackwood's reach is long, and his memory for slights even longer." After she had gone, Sarah paced the cabin, energy radiating from her slight frame. "Do you think it's true?" she asked for perhaps the 10th time. "About Ma? I think it's worth finding out," Mason replied patiently. Sarah stopped pacing, her expression suddenly vulnerable. "What if she doesn't want me anymore? What if that's why she never came back?" The fear behind the question, the fear of rejection, of being unwanted even by her own mother, tore at Mason's heart. "Sarah," he said gently, "any mother would be proud to call you her daughter. You're brave, smart, and stronger than most grown men I know." Sarah ducked her head, but not before Mason caught the hint of a pleased smile. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face, reminding him just how young she truly was beneath the layers of hardship. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Soon," Mason promised. "We need to prepare properly. It's at least 3 days' ride to Widow's Peak through difficult terrain." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious again. "We need to be careful. Blackwood will be looking for us." "Yes, he will," Mason agreed, impressed by her practical assessment. "That's why we'll take the back trails Abigail mentioned." Sarah was silent for a moment, her fingers playing with the silver pendant in her pocket. "Mason's. Yes. Thank you for believing me. About my ma, I mean." The simple gratitude in her words caught him off guard. "You don't need to thank me for that, Sarah." "Still," she insisted, "not many would." Her eyes, gray as storm clouds, held his. "I won't forget it." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. This child, who had every reason to distrust the world, was offering him her fragile trust. It was a gift he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he deserved, but he swore silently that he would not betray it. That night, as Sarah slept more peacefully than she had since arriving at Lone Pine, Mason sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle and making mental preparations for their journey. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its lonely cry echoing across the silent ranch. Mason's thoughts turned to Elizabeth and Michael, buried beneath the lone pine on the ridge. What would Elizabeth think of this unexpected turn his life had taken? She had always wanted more children, had dreamed of filling their home with laughter and love. "I'm trying to do right by her, Lizzie," he whispered to the empty room. "I don't know if I can, but I'm trying." The fire crackled in response, sending sparks up the chimney into the Montana night. Somewhere out there, Rebecca Emerson might be looking at the same stars, wondering about the daughter she'd left behind. And somewhere else, Victor Blackwood was undoubtedly planning his next move in a game Mason had only begun to understand. Dawn broke over Lone Pine Ranch in a wash of pale gold, illuminating the dew-drenched grass and casting long shadows across the yard. Mason stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, watching as the world slowly came to life. Behind him, through the cabin window, he could see Sarah packing provisions into saddlebags with methodical precision. Her movements were quick and efficient, betraying both her eagerness to begin their journey and her anxiety about what they might find. Abigail Winters had delivered the promised map the previous day, along with additional supplies and a warning. Blackwood's men have been asking questions in town. They know the girl's with you, and they're watching the main trails. Mason had spent the evening studying the faded map, tracing the thin lines that represented forgotten paths through some of Montana's most unforgiving terrain. It would add days to their journey, but if it kept them away from Blackwood's scouts, the detour was worth it. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Instantly alert, Mason set down his coffee and moved his hand to his holster. Through the early morning mist, a lone rider appeared, pushing his horse hard. Mason recognized him immediately. Gabriel Martinez, a young Mexican who occasionally worked for neighboring ranches. Gabriel's family had lived in the territory since before it was American soil, but that hadn't stopped Blackwood from driving them off their ancestral lands 3 years prior. "Mr. Reed," Gabriel called, reining his lathered horse to a stop in the yard. "Thank God you're still here." Mason moved swiftly down the porch steps. "What's happened, Gabriel?" The young man dismounted, his face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Blackwood's men, they're coming, at least 10 riders armed. They left Coyote Creek at first light heading this way." A cold weight settled in Mason's stomach. "How long do we have?" 2 hours, maybe less if they push hard." Gabriel glanced toward the cabin where Sarah now stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "Sheriff Wallace is with them. They're saying they have a warrant for your arrest for kidnapping." Mason swore under his breath. So Blackwood had managed to persuade the law to do his dirty work after all. No surprise there. "You need to go," Gabriel urged, now before they blocked the mountain pass. Mason nodded his thanks. "We were just about to leave. You've risked a lot coming here, Gabriel." The young man's dark eyes flashed with an old anger. "My father would still have his land if more people had stood against Blackwood. I won't make the same mistake." Inside the cabin, Sarah had already finished packing. She looked up as Mason entered, reading his expression with unsettling accuracy. "They're coming," she stated, not a question. "Yes, we need to move quickly." Mason retrieved his rifle from its place above the mantel and checked that it was loaded. "The plan hasn't changed, just the timing. We'll take the north trail through Eagle Canyon, then cut east toward Widow's Peak." Sarah nodded, all business. "I'm ready." Mason paused, struck by the quiet determination in her voice. This child, who had endured so much already, was preparing to face even more hardship without complaint. The weight of responsibility pressed on him anew. Outside, Gabriel had watered his horse and was preparing to leave. "I'll head south," he told Mason. "Try to draw them off your trail if I can." "No, Huite," Mason said firmly. "You've done enough. Get yourself to safety." Gabriel grinned, a flash of white teeth in his sun-darkened face. "With respect, Mr. Reed, I know these mountains better than any of Blackwood's men. They won't catch me." Before Mason could argue further, the young man swung onto his horse. "Vaya con Dios," he called, and then he was off, riding south toward the flatlands. Mason and Sarah were mounted and ready within minutes, the sorrel gelding and the sturdy pinto mare laden with supplies for the journey ahead. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's gaze lingered on the cabin. "We'll be back," Mason assured her, reading her thoughts. Sarah looked doubtful but said nothing as she urged her mount forward. They rode hard for the first hour, keeping to the tree line where possible to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Mason led them north away from the main trail, following a barely visible path that wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across rocky streams. The horses moved sure-footedly over the difficult terrain, but the pace was taxing. By midday, they had reached the mouth of Eagle Canyon, a narrow defile that cut through the first range of mountains. Here, Mason called a halt to rest the horses and check their back trail. "See anything?" Sarah asked, joining him on a rocky outcrop that provided a view of the valley below. Mason handed her his spyglass. "Take a look." She put the glass to her eye, adjusting it with care. After a moment, she inhaled sharply. "Riders, 7, maybe 8 of them." "Good eyes," Mason said, impressed. "They're following our trail, but they're at least 2 hours behind us. The canyon will slow them even more." Sarah lowered the glass, her expression troubled. "Why is he doing this, Blackwood, I mean? Why go to all this trouble for one girl?" It was a question Mason had been pondering himself. Blackwood was a man who collected power like some men collected gold coins, but his obsession with retrieving Sarah seemed disproportionate, even accounting for his wounded pride. "I'm not sure," Mason admitted, But your father knew something Blackwood didn't want getting out. Maybe he thinks you know it too. Sarah frowned. If Pa knew something that could hurt Blackwood, why didn't he use it? Why let things get so bad? Fear, maybe. Or he was protecting someone. Mason studied her face. Do you remember your father ever talking about his work for Blackwood? Anything unusual he might have seen or heard? Sarah shook her head slowly. Pa didn't talk much about those days. He just said working for Blackwood was the biggest mistake he ever made. A shadow crossed her face. Until he lost Will, anyway. They resumed their journey, entering the narrow confines of Eagle Canyon. The path here was treacherous, barely wide enough for the horses in some places, with sheer rock walls rising on either side. The sun reached the canyon floor only at midday, leaving the rest in perpetual shadow. Sarah rode in silence, lost in her own thoughts. Mason gave her space, understanding that she was processing not just the immediate danger, but the possibility that her mother might still be alive, and that her father might have lied to her about it. As they made their way deeper into the canyon, Mason kept a wary eye on the cliff tops above. This would be a perfect place for an ambush, the narrow walls creating a natural shooting gallery. But the only movement was the occasional golden eagle soaring high overhead, riding the thermal currents that rose from the sun-warmed rock. By late afternoon, they emerged from the canyon into a high mountain meadow dotted with wildflowers. The unexpected beauty after the grim confines of the canyon made even Mason pause in appreciation. We'll camp here tonight, he decided. The horses need rest, and we've put enough distance between us and Blackwood's men for now. They made camp in a small grove of aspens near a clear stream. While Mason tended to the horses, Sarah gathered firewood and filled their canteens. Working together without need for instruction, they had a small fire going and a simple meal prepared by the time darkness fell. As they ate, Sarah broke her long silence. "Tell me about being a lawman," she said suddenly. Mason looked up, surprised by the request. "What do you want to know?" She shrugged, poking at the fire with a stick. "What made you want to do it? Be a deputy marshal, I mean." Mason considered the question, memory surfacing that he hadn't examined in years. "I came back from the war with no purpose," he said finally. "Saw too much killing, too much chaos. Thought maybe being on the side of law might balance the scales a bit." "Did it?" A wry smile tugged at his mouth. "For a time. There's satisfaction in helping folks who can't help themselves, in standing between them and those who do them harm." Sarah absorbed this, her face solemn in the firelight. "But you quit." "I did. Because of Blackwood." Mason stared into the flames, seeing not the campfire, but another fire, the one that had taken everything from him. "Partly. After Elizabeth and Michael died, I brought my suspicions to the circuit judge. Had evidence that the fire wasn't accidental, that Blackwood's men had been seen near our property that day." His voice hardened. Judge dismissed it all, said my grief was making me see conspiracies where there were none. "But you knew the truth," Sarah said quietly. "I knew," Mason confirmed. "And I knew then that the law, or at least the law as practiced in Coyote Creek, wasn't interested in justice. Not when it came to Victor Blackwood." Sarah's next question caught him off guard. "Do you regret it, giving up your badge?" Mason looked at her, this child asking questions no child should have to contemplate. "I regret not finding another way to fight," he said honestly. "Walking away didn't solve anything. It just let Blackwood grow stronger." "But now you're fighting again," Sarah observed, "because of me." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them fully understood yet. "Get some sleep," Mason said gently. "We've got a long ride ahead tomorrow." As Sarah settled into her bedroll, Mason took the first watch rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath them. Tomorrow would bring them closer to Widow's Peak and perhaps to Rebecca Emerson. If she was truly alive, what then? Mason hadn't thought beyond finding her, hadn't considered what it would mean for Sarah. Or for himself. He'd grown accustomed to the girl's presence in the short time she'd been with him. Her quiet strength, her sharp mind, the way she approached each task with determined focus, all of it had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. A sense of purpose, of responsibility, perhaps even hope. The realization unsettled him. He'd walled himself off after Elizabeth and Michael died, determined never to be vulnerable again. Yet here he was, risking everything for a child he barely knew. Around midnight, Sarah's soft voice broke into his thoughts. Mason, are you awake? He turned to find her sitting up in her bedroll, knees drawn to her chest. Can't sleep. She shook her head. I keep thinking about Ma. Trying to remember her face, she hesitated. It's getting harder. To remember, I mean. The admission seemed to pain her, as though forgetting her mother's features was a betrayal. That happens, Mason said. Time, it changes memories, softens the edges. I don't want to forget her, Sarah said fiercely. You won't, Mason assured her. Not the important things, not the way she made you feel. Sarah was quiet for a moment, digesting this. Then so softly, Mason almost missed it. I'm afraid. Of what? Of finding her. Of not finding her. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. What if she's different? What if I'm different? Mason moved to sit beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. You will be different. Both of you. That's the nature of time and hardship. But some things don't change, Sarah. A mother's love for her child, that's bone deep. It endures. How do you know? Mason thought of Elizabeth, of the fierce protective love she'd had for Michael. I just do. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the mountain meadow, the whisper of wind through aspen leaves, the distant call of a coyote enveloping them. You should try to sleep, Mason said eventually. I'll wake you for your watch in a few hours. Sarah nodded and lay back down, pulling her blanket up to her chin. But before she closed her eyes, she said, Mason, thank you for everything. The simple gratitude caught in his chest like a physical thing. You're welcome, Sarah. Now sleep. Dawn came too soon, gray light seeping into the eastern sky as Mason and Sarah broke camp. They moved with the efficiency of those accustomed to early mornings and hard work, saying little as they packed their gear and saddled the horses. The day's journey took them through higher country, the trail winding through stands of lodgepole pine and across alpine meadows still wet with morning dew. As they rode, Mason kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they had reached a high ridge that offered a sweeping view of the territory they'd traversed. Far below, Eagle Canyon cut a dark gash through the forested mountains. Beyond it, the plains stretched toward the horizon, golden in the summer sun. We've made good time, Mason observed as they paused to rest the horses. Widow's Peak is there. He pointed to a distinctive mountain to the northeast, its twin summits silhouetted against the sky. We should reach the foothills by nightfall. Sarah studied the distant peak, her expression a mixture of anticipation and dread. Do you think she's really there, Ma? I don't know, Mason answered honestly, but we'll find out. They were preparing to continue when a movement on the trail below caught Mason's eye. He reached for his spyglass, focusing on the distant figure. A rider pushing his mount hard up the mountainside. Even at this distance, Mason recognized the distinctive sorrel coat of Gabriel Martinez's horse. Trouble, he said grimly, handing the glass to Sarah. She looked, then lowered the glass with a frown. Why is he coming after us? I thought he was heading south. So did I. They watched as Gabriel urged his tired horse up the steep trail toward their position. When he was within hailing distance, Mason called down to him. That's far enough, Gabriel. What brings you back our way? Gabriel reined in his mount, raising his hands to show he was no threat. Mr. Reed, thank God I found you. You need to change course. Blackwood's men have split up. Half are still following your trail through Eagle Canyon, but the others are circling around to cut you off before Widow's Peak. Mason's mind raced, calculating distances and likely routes. How do you know this? I overheard them at a campsite last night. They don't know these mountains like I do. I can show you another way. Sarah glanced at Mason, her expression guarded. Can we trust him? It was a fair question. Gabriel had been helpful thus far, but in these circumstances, caution was warranted. Come up slowly, Mason instructed, hand resting near his holster. Just you, not your horse. Gabriel dismounted and climbed the last stretch on foot, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. When he reached them, he was breathing hard from the exertion. Blackwood's offering $50 for information on your whereabouts now, he reported, and $100 for the girl delivered unharmed. Mason's jaw tightened. That's a lot of money for a debt supposedly settled. It's not about money anymore, Gabriel said. It's about making an example. No one defies Victor Blackwood and walks away. Sarah had been studying Gabriel intently. Now she spoke up. You worked for Blackwood once, didn't you, at his North Ranch? Gabriel's expression darkened. For a time, after he drove my family off our land, there weren't many who would hire Mexicans. I needed the work. But you left, Sarah pressed. I saw things no man should see, Gabriel said simply. He turned to Mason. We're wasting time. If we take the old mining trail through Thunder Basin, we can reach Widow's Peak from the west. Blackwood's men won't expect that approach. Mason considered their options. The mining trail would be treacherous. It hadn't been maintained in years since the silver veins played out, but if Gabriel was right about Blackwood's men, they had little choice. All right, he decided. Lead the way. They followed Gabriel along the ridge and then down a barely visible trail that switched back steeply into a narrow valley. The path was indeed hazardous, forcing them to dismount in places and lead the horses over particularly difficult stretches. As they rode, Mason kept a careful eye on their guide. Gabriel seemed genuinely determined to help, but there was something in his manner, a tension, a watchfulness, that suggested he wasn't sharing everything he knew. How did you end up working for Blackwood? Mason asked casually as they navigated a rocky stretch of trail. Gabriel's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. As I said, there weren't many options after we lost our land. Must have been difficult, Mason observed, working for the man who took everything from your family. Yes. The word was clipped final. Sarah, riding between them, spoke up. Did you know my father, Thomas Emerson? Gabriel glanced back at her, surprise evident in his expression. Yes, I knew him. He managed the North Ranch where I worked. What was he like back then, I mean? Gabriel seemed to weigh his words carefully. He was fair, treated the workers decently, which was more than could be said for most of Blackwood's foremen. Did he and Blackwood get along? Another hesitation. They did until they didn't. What changed? Mason prompted. Gabriel's gaze flicked to him, then away. I don't know the details. There was an argument. After that, your father left Blackwood's employ rather suddenly. Sarah absorbed this, her brow furrowed in thought. And my mother, did you know her too? A shadow crossed Gabriel's face. Miss Rebecca. Yes, I knew her. She was kind to me. Taught me some English words when the other hands mocked my accent. Was she happy? With my father, I mean. The question seemed to catch Gabriel off guard. I couldn't say. It wasn't my place to notice such things. But his averted gaze and the tension in his shoulders told a different story. He had noticed, and what he'd seen troubled him still. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, as the sun arced across the sky. By late afternoon they had entered Thunder Basin, a stark landscape of weathered rock and stunted pine trees, scarred by the abandoned workings of played-out silver mines. We'll camp here tonight, Gabriel announced, indicating a level area beside a small spring. It's sheltered from view, and there's water for the horses. As they made camp, Mason took Gabriel aside. I need the truth from you, he said quietly, ensuring Sarah was out of earshot. What aren't you telling us about Thomas and Rebecca Emerson? Gabriel's dark eyes met his, defiant at first, then resigned. It's not my story to tell, Mr. Reed. It becomes your story when you lead us into the wilderness based on half-truths, Mason countered. Sarah deserves to know what we're riding into. Gabriel was silent for a long moment, internal conflict evident in his face. Finally, he sighed. Very well, but not tonight. The girl needs rest, and this is not a story for tired minds. Mason studied him, then nodded once. Tomorrow, then. First light. That night, Mason took first watch again, his rifle across his knees, as he surveyed the dark basin. The abandoned mines dotted the landscape like open wounds, their gaping entrances black against the moonlit rock. In the distance, Widow's Peak loomed its twin summits, reminiscent of a woman's silhouette against the night sky. What secrets waited for them there? And what was Gabriel hiding about Sarah's parents? The question circled in Mason's mind as the hours passed. When it was time to wake Gabriel for his watch, he found the young man already awake, staring into the dying embers of their fire. Couldn't sleep, Mason asked, settling beside him. Gabriel shook his head. Too many ghosts in these mountains. You promised me the truth in the morning, Mason reminded him, about the Emersons. Gabriel's expression was troubled in the faint firelight. The truth is rarely simple, Mr. Reed, and sometimes it's dangerous. I'm well acquainted with danger, Mason said dryly. A hint of a smile touched Gabriel's lips. Yes, I believe you are. He glanced toward Sarah's sleeping form. She's a brave girl. like her mother. Tell me about Rebecca, Mason prompted. The real story, not the one Blackwood spread about her dying of fever. Gabriel was silent for so long that Mason thought he might refuse after all. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, Rebecca Emerson did not die. She escaped from Blackwood's ranch 3 years ago after he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. After he claimed her as payment for her husband's debts. Cold anger settled in Mason's gut. The same way he tried to claim Sarah. Gabriel nodded grimly. It's a pattern with Blackwood. He finds men in desperate circumstances, offers them loans they can't possibly repay, then takes what they value most. Land, livestock. Sometimes family. And Thomas Emerson allowed this, his own wife. You don't understand, Gabriel said, a flash of anger in his eyes. No one allows anything when it comes to Blackwood. He takes, that's all. He drew a deep breath. Thomas was a broken man by then. Blackwood had systematically stripped away everything he had, his pride, his livelihood, his self-respect. By the time Blackwood demanded, Rebecca Thomas had nothing left to fight with. Mason struggled to reconcile this with the man who had later wagered his own daughter in a card game. But he let Sarah believe her mother was dead. Why, Paul? Protection, perhaps, Gabriel suggested, or shame, or maybe Blackwood convinced him it was true. A realization struck Mason. You helped her escape, didn't you, Rebecca? Gabriel's silence was confirmation enough. That's why you're so determined to help us now, Mason continued. You know where she is. I know where she was, Gabriel corrected. Whether she's still there, he shrugged. It's been 3 years. Why didn't you tell us this from the beginning? Gabriel's expression hardened. Because I've seen what Blackwood does to those who cross him. I wanted to be sure you were committed to this path before I risked her safety and mine by revealing what I know. Mason could understand the caution even if he didn't entirely trust the source. And now you're sure, now I've seen how you are with the girl, Gabriel said simply. How you protect her, how you listen to her. Most men wouldn't bother. The observation was uncomfortably perceptive. Mason changed the subject. What about Thomas? What happened after Rebecca escaped? A shadow crossed Gabriel's face. He tried to follow her. Blackwood's men caught him. I don't know what they did to him, but when he returned to town weeks later, he was different, broken in a new way. That's when the drinking started, the gambling. The pieces were beginning to fit together, a picture of systematic destruction of a man hollowed out by grief and guilt, until he became capable of the unthinkable, wagering his own child. Does Sarah know any of this? Mason asked. I don't think so, Gabriel replied. How could she? Thomas would never speak of it, and Blackwood certainly wouldn't admit to what he'd done. Mason glanced at Sarah's sleeping form, her face peaceful in a way it rarely was when awake. She needs to know. Before we find Rebecca, she deserves to understand what happened to her family. Gabriel nodded solemnly. Yes, but such truths must be delivered with care. I'll tell her in the morning, Mason decided. And then we ride for Widow's Peak. The conversation lapsed into silence, each man lost in his own thoughts as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Mason retired to his bedroll, leaving Gabriel to his watch. Sleep was elusive, his mind churning with the revelations of the night. If Gabriel was telling the truth and Mason's instincts suggested he was, then they were riding toward a reunion that would forever alter Sarah's understanding of her past, and perhaps his own future as well. Dawn broke clear and cold over Thunder Basin, the first rays of sunlight striking the twin peaks of Widow's Mountain. Mason was already awake, having slept fitfully. Sarah emerged from her bedroll shortly after, her hair tousled, but her eyes alert. Morning, she greeted him, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Where's Gabriel? Mason glanced toward the small rise where their guide had taken the last watch. Checking our back trail. He should be back soon. Sarah nodded, sipping her coffee in silence for a moment. Then with the directness that was becoming familiar. You two were talking about me last night. It wasn't a question. Mason sighed inwardly. He should have known she would be aware, even in sleep. Yes, he admitted. Gabriel has information about your mother and your father. Sarah's knuckles whitened around her cup. What kind of information? Boy, the kind that changes things, Mason said gently. Are you sure you want to hear it now? She fixed him with a steady gaze. I've been waiting 3 years, Mason. I don't want to wait any longer. He nodded, respecting her decision. All right, but it's not an easy story. Carefully, he related what Gabriel had told him about Blackwood's pattern of predation, about Thomas's gradual destruction, about Rebecca being claimed as payment for debt. He watched Sarah's face as he spoke, ready to stop if the revelations became too much. But she listened with the same stoic composure she brought to everything, only the occasional flicker in her eyes betraying her inner turmoil. When he reached the part about Rebecca's escape, aided by Gabriel, Sarah finally spoke. So Ma didn't abandon me? She was taken. Yes, Mason confirmed, and she fought her way free at great risk. But she didn't come back for me. The words were flat, neither accusation nor question. We don't know why, Mason said. Perhaps she couldn't. Perhaps she tried and was prevented. We won't know until we find her. Sarah absorbed this, her gaze distant. And Pa, he just let it happen. Let Blackwood take her. This was the hardest part to explain, especially to a child. How did one convey the slow erosion of a man's will, the gradual breaking of his spirit until choices no longer seemed like choices at all? Your father was a broken man by then, Mason said carefully. Blackwood had taken everything else from him. His resistance, it had been worn away. The way water wears away stone, Sarah murmured, surprising Mason with the apt metaphor, until there's nothing left but sand. Yes, he agreed, something like that. She was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then, is that why he wagered me, because he was sand? The question broke Mason's heart. I can't speak to your father's thoughts, Sarah. Only he knows what drove him to that decision. But you wouldn't have done it, she pressed, no matter what. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. No, I wouldn't have. Sarah nodded as though confirming something to herself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pendant, her mother's sunburst. He gave me this after he said she died. Told me it was all he had left of her. Her voice hardened. That was a lie, too. Before Mason could respond, Gabriel appeared at the crest of the small rise, his expression urgent. Riders, he called, coming up the main trail from the east, 6 of them moving fast. Mason was on his feet instantly. Blackwood's men. I think so. They're too far to identify, but who else would be in these mountains? How did they find us? Sarah asked, already moving to break camp. Gabriel shook his head. I don't know. They shouldn't have known about the mining trail. A cold suspicion formed in Mason's mind, unless someone told them. Gabriel met his gaze steadily. If you're suggesting I betrayed you, I'm not suggesting anything, Mason interrupted, just considering all possibilities. We need to move, Gabriel insisted. The western approach to Widow's Peak is steep but passable. If we push hard, we can reach the summit by midday. Mason studied him, weighing trust against caution. Finally, he nodded. Lead the way. But Gabriel, if this is a trap, you won't live to regret it. The young man's face hardened. I risked everything to help Rebecca Emerson escape. I wouldn't betray her daughter now. They broke camp, quickly erasing all signs of their presence before mounting up. Gabriel led them on a grueling ascent through increasingly rugged terrain. The trail, little more than a game path in places, wound through dense stands of pine and across boulder fields where one misstep could mean disaster. Mason kept Sarah close, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit or ambush. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher as they ascended toward the twin peaks that gave Widow's Mountain its name. Not much farther, Gabriel called back to them as they navigated a particularly treacherous stretch. There's a plateau between the peaks. That's where a gunshot cracked through the mountain air, the bullet splintering bark from a pine tree inches from Gabriel's head. Instantly, Mason pulled Sarah from her horse, dragging her behind a large boulder as more shots followed. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his rifle and searching for the source of the fire. Another shot, another splinter of wood. Gabriel had taken cover behind a fallen log, his own pistol drawn, but held in check, unsure where to aim. There, Sarah pointed to a rocky outcrop about 100 yards up the slope. Mason caught a glimpse of movement, a rifle barrel glinting in the sunlight. He sighted carefully and fired. The shot echoed across the mountainside, followed by a cry of pain. One down, but how many more? We're pinned, Gabriel called from his position. They have the high ground. Mason's mind raced, assessing their options. They were exposed with limited cover and unknown numbers against them. A frontal assault would be suicide. Retreat would lead them back into the path of the riders Gabriel had spotted earlier. We need to flank them, he decided. Gabriel, can you draw their fire? Keep them focused upslope while Sarah and I work around to the side. Gabriel nodded grimly. I can try. Mason, Sarah whispered urgently. There's another way. Look. She pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face beside them, partially hidden by brush. It might lead up. Mason examined the opening. It was tight. A grown man would have to squeeze through, but it appeared to angle upward through the mountain. It's too dangerous, he said. We don't know where it leads, or if it narrows further in. I can fit, Sarah insisted. I can go up and come around behind them. Absolutely not, Mason said firmly. I'm not sending you alone against armed men. You're not sending me against anyone, Sarah countered. I'm just going to see where they are, how many. Then I'll come back and report. Another volley of gunfire interrupted them, bullets whining off rocks uncomfortably close. They needed to move, and soon. Mason looked at Sarah, really looked at her. The determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. This wasn't a child asking permission. This was a survivor making a tactical assessment. You go up, you look, you come straight back, he said finally. At the first sign of danger, you retreat. Understood. She nodded solemnly. Understood. I'll cover you to the entrance, Mason said, then called to Gabriel. On my mark, lay down, covering fire. Gabriel acknowledged with a raised hand. Now, Mason shouted, and Gabriel began firing rapidly at the rocks above. Under the cover of gunfire, Mason and Sarah darted to the crevice. It was indeed narrow, but as Sarah had guessed, just wide enough for her slender frame. Be careful, Mason said, helping her into the opening. And Sarah, if anything happens to me, get to Widow's Peak. Find your mother. She looked back at him, a sudden vulnerability in her eyes. Nothing's going to happen to you. Before he could respond, she had slipped into the crevice and was gone, swallowed by the mountain shadow. Mason returned to his position, exchanging fire with the unseen assailants, while Gabriel reloaded. The girl, Gabriel asked. Finding another way up, Mason replied tersely. You let her go alone. Disbelief colored Gabriel's voice. She's tougher than she looks, Mason said, though his own concern gnawed at him. And she can move more quietly than either of us. They maintained a steady exchange of fire, careful to conserve ammunition, while keeping the attackers' attention focused on their position. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours with no sign of Sarah's return. Then, just as Mason was considering a desperate charge upslope, a single shot rang out from above, but from behind their attacker's position. It was followed by shouts of confusion and another shot. That's our cue, Mason said grimly. Now. He and Gabriel broke cover, simultaneously firing as they advanced up the slope. Caught between two lines of fire, their attackers were thrown into disarray. Mason caught glimpses of them scrambling for new positions, 3 men, maybe 4. As he and Gabriel closed in, the opposition suddenly broke, abandoning their ambush to retreat further up the mountain. Mason held his fire, unwilling to waste bullets on fleeing targets. Sarah, he called, scanning the rocks anxiously. Here. Her voice came from above, and then she appeared scrambling down from a ledge with a nimbleness that belied her recent captivity. Her face was flushed with exertion, but unharmed. Relief washed over Mason, so intense it was almost painful. Are you all right? She nodded. I'm fine. There were 4 of them. I recognized one, Jedediah Parker. They're heading for the plateau. Gabriel's expression darkened. That's where, he broke off, glancing at Sarah. Where my mother might be, she finished for him. We need to hurry. Buston checked his rifle, counting his remaining ammunition. Did they see you, Sarah? She shook her head. I don't think so. I stayed hidden until I fired that first shot, aimed at the rocks above them, not at them directly. Buston couldn't help but be impressed by her tactical thinking. Good. Then they don't know our numbers. That might work to our advantage. They retrieved their horses, which had fortunately not strayed far during the gunfight, and continued their ascent with increased urgency. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner as they climbed toward the plateau Gabriel had mentioned. We're close, Gabriel said as they rounded a bend in the trail. The plateau is just ahead between the twin peaks. Mason halted, signaling for the others to do the same. We approach carefully, as he instructed. If Parker and his men got there first, he didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the danger. They left the horses secured in a small grove of pines and proceeded on foot, moving as silently as possible through the underbrush. As they neared the edge of the plateau, Mason signaled for Sarah to stay back while he and Gabriel scouted ahead. The plateau was a natural clearing maybe 100 yards across, carpeted with alpine meadow grasses and wildflowers. At its center stood a small cabin, weathered by years of mountain storms but still solid. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, suggesting occupation. Of Parker and his men, there was no sign. "That's it," Gabriel whispered. "That's where I brought her." Rebecca. Mason scanned the surrounding trees and rocks, searching for any hint of an ambush. "It's too quiet. Parker and his men should have reached here before us." Gabriel nodded, his expression tense. "Maybe they circled around, approached from the other side. Or maybe they're waiting for us to walk into the open," Mason suggested grimly. They retreated to where Sarah waited, her face alight with anticipation. "Did you see her? Is she there?" "There's a cabin," Mason told her. "Someone's inside. There's smoke from the chimney. But Parker and his men are unaccounted for, which concerns me." Sarah's expression turned determined. "We've come too far to turn back now." "No one's suggesting we turn back," Mason assured her. "But we need to be careful. If this is a trap—" "It's not a trap," Gabriel interrupted, his voice strained. "At least not of my making. I brought Rebecca Emerson to that cabin 3 years ago. I've visited twice since to bring supplies. She was there living alone." "Then where are Parker and his men?" Mason demanded. As if in answer, a woman's scream pierced the mountain air coming from the direction of the cabin. Sarah's face went white. "Ma." She started forward, but Mason caught her arm. "Wait," he cautioned. "It could be." But Sarah had already torn free of his grip and was running toward the plateau, heedless of the danger. Mason swore and sprinted after her, Gabriel close behind. They broke from the cover of the trees just in time to see Sarah charging across the open ground toward the cabin. At the same moment, the cabin door burst open and a woman stumbled out, pursued by Jedediah Parker. Even at a distance, the resemblance between mother and daughter was unmistakable. Rebecca Emerson had the same dark hair, the same slender build as Sarah, though years of hardship had carved lines into a face that had once been beautiful. "Ma!" Sarah's cry carried across the plateau. Rebecca's head snapped up, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Sarah!" Parker seized Rebecca by the arm, a cruel smile twisting his features as he spotted Sarah running toward them. "Well, well," he drawled. "Isn't this convenient? The girl comes to us." He raised his pistol, aiming not at Sarah, but at Mason, who was closing the distance rapidly. "Stop right there, Reed," Parker called, "or the woman dies first, then the girl." Mason skidded to a halt, his rifle half raised. Behind Parker, 3 more of Blackwood's men emerged from the cabin, weapons drawn. "Let them go, Parker," Mason said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Your quarrel is with me." Parker's laugh was ugly. "My quarrel is with whoever Mr. Blackwood says it is, and right now that includes you, the girl, and this woman who's been hiding from justice for 3 years. "Justice?" Rebecca spat, struggling against Parker's grip. "Is that what Victor calls it now?" "Shut up!" Parker snarled, twisting her arm until she gasped in pain. Sarah had stopped midway across the plateau, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. "Let her go," she demanded, her young voice surprisingly authoritative. Parker's attention shifted to her, amusement replacing anger. "Aren't you a spirited one, just like your mother? Blackwood's going to enjoy breaking that spirit." "Nobody's breaking anything," Mason said, his mind racing for a solution. 4 armed men against his rifle and Gabriel's pistol. The odds weren't good, especially with Rebecca as a hostage. Gabriel had moved to Mason's side, his own weapon trained on Parker. "This ends here," he said, an edge to his voice Mason hadn't heard before. "Let Miss Emerson go." Parker's eyes narrowed as he recognized Gabriel. "The Mexican. Should have known you'd be involved in this." His smile turned predatory. "Blackwood's been looking for you too. Seems you've caused him a lot of trouble over the years." "Less than he deserves," Gabriel retorted. The standoff stretched, tension building like the pressure before a thunderstorm. Mason assessed angles, distances, possibilities. If he could get Parker to release Rebecca, they might stand a chance. But as long as she was a hostage— Sarah broke the impasse. In a move so unexpected it caught everyone off guard, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her mother's silver pendant, holding it high. "Is this what you want?" she called to Parker. "The proof my father found. The reason Blackwood's so desperate to find us." Parker's expression flickered with confusion, then calculation. "What are you talking about, girl?" Sarah took a step forward, the pendant catching the sunlight. "The deed to the North Valley. The one Blackwood forged. Pa found the original, didn't he? That's why Blackwood took Ma. That's why he wants me now." Mason stared at her, momentarily bewildered. What was she talking about? Then understanding dawned. She was creating a diversion, playing for time. Parker's grip on Rebecca loosened slightly as his attention fixed on the pendant. "Hand it over, girl, and maybe I'll let your mother live." "Sarah, no," Rebecca cried. "Don't believe him." But Sarah was already moving forward, the pendant dangling from her hand like bait. "You want it? Come and get it." As Parker's focus shifted fully to Sarah, Mason saw his opening. He fired not at Parker, but at the ground at his feet. The sudden shot startled Parker enough that his grip on Rebecca slackened. She wrenched free, ducking and rolling, as Mason and Gabriel opened fire in earnest. Chaos erupted on the plateau. Parker and his men scattered for cover, returning fire wildly. Rebecca sprinted toward her daughter, tackling Sarah to the ground, just as a bullet whizzed through the space where she had been standing. Mason advanced, using the confusion to close the distance. He caught a glimpse of mother and daughter crawling toward the shelter of a boulder. Rebecca's arms wrapped protectively around Sarah. A bullet grazed Mason's arm, tearing through his sleeve and drawing blood. He ignored the sting, focused entirely on the fight. Gabriel was moving to flank Parker's position, firing steadily to keep the gunman pinned down. One of Blackwood's men broke cover, making a dash toward where Rebecca and Sarah had taken shelter. Mason dropped him with a clean shot to the chest. Parker, seeing his advantage slipping away, unleashed a volley of wild shots before breaking for the trees at the edge of the plateau. The remaining two gunmen followed his lead, firing sporadically as they retreated. Mason was tempted to pursue, but concern for Sarah and Rebecca outweighed his desire to end the threat permanently. He signaled to Gabriel to hold position, then moved cautiously toward the boulder where mother and daughter had taken cover. "Sarah, Rebecca, are you hurt?" he called. Sarah's face appeared at the edge of the boulder, tear-streaked but determined. "We're all right. Ma's here. She's really here." And then Rebecca emerged, one arm still protectively around her daughter's shoulders. She was thinner than in the photograph Mason had seen at the Emerson homestead, her face weathered by years of hardship, but her eyes. Sarah's eyes were bright with fierce love and relief. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice breaking on the words. "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." The reunion Mason had imagined, had worked toward, was finally happening before his eyes. Mother and daughter clung to each other, 3 years of separation dissolving in tears and whispered words of love and disbelief. Gabriel approached his pistol, still at the ready as he scanned the tree line. Parker and the others are gone for now, but they'll be back, and with reinforcements. Mason nodded grimly. "We need to move. This place isn't safe anymore." Rebecca looked up, her arms still around Sarah. "There's a cave system behind the cabin. We can hide there until nightfall, then make our way down the western slope." "Will Parker know about the caves?" Mason asked. "No," Rebecca said confidently. "I only discovered them last year. The entrance is hidden behind a rockfall." It was the best option they had. Mason nodded his agreement, then turned to Gabriel. "Bring the horses. We'll meet you at the cabin." As Gabriel departed, Mason approached mother and daughter. Sarah was showing Rebecca the silver pendant, explaining through tears how she had kept it safe all these years, believing it was all she had left of her mother. Rebecca touched it reverently. "I never thought I'd see this again." "Or you, my brave girl." She looked up at Mason. "How did you find her? How did you know to bring her here?" "It's a long story," Mason said, "and we'll have time for it later. Right now, we need to reach those caves." Rebecca nodded, understanding the urgency. She stood, keeping one arm around Sarah, as though afraid the girl might disappear if she let go. As they made their way toward the cabin, Sarah looked back at Mason, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and gratitude that hit him like a physical force. In that moment, despite the danger still surrounding them, he knew with absolute certainty that he had done the right thing. Whatever came next, Blackwood's vengeance, the uncertain future, it was worth it for that look alone. The cave system behind Rebecca's cabin proved more extensive than Mason had anticipated. A narrow entrance, barely visible behind a tumble of weathered rocks, opened into a series of interconnected chambers that burrowed deep into the heart of Widow's Peak. Rebecca led them confidently through the dim passages, the light from her pine-pitched torch casting long shadows against the limestone walls. "I explored these caves during my first winter here," she explained, as they made their way deeper into the mountain. "There were days when the snow was so deep I couldn't leave the cabin. I needed to know I had somewhere to hide if Blackwood's men ever found me." Sarah walked close beside her mother, their shoulders touching, as though afraid any separation might prove permanent. The girl's eyes were still bright with the wonder of reunion, but Mason noted how she constantly glanced back, ensuring he was still following. Gabriel brought up the rear, leading the horses with difficulty through the narrower passages. The animals were nervous in the confined space, their hooves striking sparks from the stone floor. "How much farther?" Mason asked, mindful of the diminishing daylight outside. Parker and his remaining men would likely return with reinforcements before nightfall. "Not far," Rebecca assured him. "There's a chamber ahead large enough for all of us with a spring for water. We can rest there until it's safe to move." The chamber, when they reached it, was indeed spacious, a natural cathedral carved by water and time from the living rock. A small spring bubbled from a fissure in one wall, its clear water collecting in a shallow pool before disappearing into another crevice. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, their surfaces glittering with mineral deposits in the torchlight. "We'll be safe here," Rebecca said, setting her torch in a natural holder formed by a rock outcropping. "The passages are too narrow for a large group to navigate quietly. We'll hear anyone coming long before they reach us." Mason wasn't entirely convinced, but he had to admit the cave offered better protection than the exposed cabin. He helped Gabriel secure the horses, then set about checking his weapons and remaining ammunition. The firefight on the plateau had depleted his supplies more than he'd liked. Sarah and Rebecca had settled near the spring, speaking in low voices, their hands clasped tightly together. The sight stirred something in Mason's chest, an ache that was part joy, part melancholy. He'd fulfilled his promise to Sarah, reunited her with the mother she'd thought lost. It was more than he'd dared hope for when they'd set out from Lone Pine. But what came next, Gabriel approached, interrupting Mason's thoughts. "Parker will be back," he said without preamble. "And Blackwood won't be far behind. We need a plan." Mason nodded grimly. "We can't stay here indefinitely. Supplies won't last, and we're still a long way from safety." "There's a trading post 3 days' ride west of here," Gabriel suggested. "The owner, Caleb White, has no love for Blackwood. He might help us." 3 days is a long time to be exposed," Mason observed. "And we don't know how many men Blackwood can muster." Gabriel's expression darkened. "More than enough to overrun this mountain if he chooses." The gravity of their situation settled over them like a physical weight. They had won a temporary reprieve, nothing more. "We should rest while we can," Mason decided. "Take shifts keeping watch. We'll move at first light." Gabriel nodded agreement and moved away to tend to the horses. Mason found himself alone with his thoughts once more, the distant murmur of Sarah and Rebecca's conversation, a reminder of what was at stake. Elizabeth would have known what to do, he thought. She had always been the wiser of them, the one who saw paths forward where he saw only obstacles. What would she advise now? "Get the girl and her mother to safety," he could almost hear her say. "The rest will follow." But safety seemed an increasingly distant prospect. Blackwood's reach extended far beyond Coyote Creek, and his influence with territorial officials meant that legal recourse was unlikely. Even if they escaped the immediate danger, they would be looking over their shoulders for years to come, unless Blackwood was stopped, permanently. The thought took root in Mason's mind, unwelcome but persistent. One man was the source of all this suffering, not just for the Emersons, but for countless others across the territory. Remove that man, and perhaps the evil he had wrought might begin to unravel. It was the kind of frontier justice Mason had once sworn to prevent as a lawman. The kind that led to blood feuds and senseless violence. And yet, when the law itself was corrupted, what alternatives remained? "You're thinking too hard, Mr. Reed." Mason looked up to find Rebecca standing before him, her resemblance to Sarah even more pronounced in the warm glow of the torchlight. There was a quiet dignity in her bearing, despite the years of hardship etched into her features. "Just Mason," he corrected, gesturing for her to sit. And yes, I suppose I am. Rebecca settled beside him on a flat rock, her gaze direct and assessing. Sarah tells me you saved her from Blackwood, bought her freedom. I did what anyone would have done, Mason said, uncomfortable with the implicit praise. Rebecca's smile was sad. We both know that's not true. Most people in these parts are too afraid of Blackwood to stand against him. She studied him for a moment longer. You were a lawman once. It wasn't a question. Mason wondered what else Sarah had shared about him. Yes, he acknowledged, deputy marshal in Coyote Creek some years back. What changed? The directness of the question caught him off guard. He considered deflecting, giving the simplified version he'd offered others. But something in Rebecca's steady gaze, perhaps the knowledge that she had endured her own private hell at Blackwood's hands, demanded honesty. Blackwood happened, he said simply. He had my wife and son killed. Fire. Made to look like an accident. Rebecca's intake of breath was sharp but not surprised. I'm sorry, she said, and the words carried the weight of genuine understanding rather than mere sympathy. Blackwood leaves destruction in his wake wherever he goes. Your husband, Mason began, then hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question delicately. Thomas was a good man once, Rebecca said, sparing him the difficulty, before Blackwood hollowed him out. Her gaze drifted to where Sarah sat near the spring, absently braiding her hair. Does she know about what Thomas did wagering her in that card game? Mason nodded. She was there, saw it happen. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, pain flickering across her features. I should have come for her sooner. Should have found a way. Why didn't you? Mason asked the question that had been nagging at him since learning of Rebecca's survival. Her eyes opened, meeting his with unflinching honesty. Fear, shame, the belief that she was safer with Thomas than on the run with me. She drew a shaky breath. And then injury. The first winter here, I fell on the ice. Broke my leg badly. By the time I could travel again, the passes were snowed in. Her voice dropped to a whisper. There hasn't been a day I haven't thought of her. Prayed for her. Mason heard the truth in her words, saw it written in the lines of her face. Whatever mistakes Rebecca Emerson had made abandoning her daughter had not been among them. She's an extraordinary girl, he said. Brave, resourceful. You should be proud. I am, Rebecca replied softly, though I can claim little credit for the woman she's becoming. She glanced at him. She trusts you. That doesn't come easily to her. The feeling is mutual, Mason admitted. Rebecca studied him for a moment longer, something unreadable in her expression. What happens when this is over, Mason? If we survive Blackwood's vengeance, what then? It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one that had no clear answer. I don't know, he said honestly. Get you both somewhere safe, I suppose. Start again. And will you come with us? The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither of them was ready to examine fully. Before Mason could formulate a response, Gabriel appeared at the entrance to their chamber, his expression grave. Someone's coming, he reported tersely. I heard voices in the outer passage. Mason was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. How many? Can't tell. But they're being careful, moving slowly, keeping quiet. Parker, Mason muttered. He must have found the cave entrance. Rebecca had risen as well, moving swiftly to Sarah's side. There's another way out, she said. A passage that leads to the western slope. It's narrow but passable. How far? Mason asked. Half a mile, maybe more. It comes out in a stand of pines near a waterfall. Mason made a quick decision. Take Sarah and go. Gabriel and I will hold them here, buy you time. No, Sarah protested, stepping forward. We stay together. Sarah, Mason began, but she cut him off. No, she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Last time Ma and I were separated, it was for 3 years. I won't do it again. Mason looked to Rebecca for support, but her expression mirrored her daughter's determination. We stay together, she echoed. All of us. Gabriel, who had been listening at the passage entrance, returned to their side. They're moving slowly, feeling their way, probably unsure how extensive the caves are. He glanced at the small pool fed by the spring. If we follow the water, where does it lead? Rebecca's brow furrowed in thought. The spring feeds into a larger stream, deeper in the mountain. It eventually emerges on the southern face near the old mining camp. That's our way out then, Mason decided. If we can follow the watercourse, we might be able to circle around behind Parker and his men. It was a desperate plan fraught with risk, but their options were limited. The sound of distant voices was growing gradually louder. Parker and his men were getting closer. They moved quickly, gathering only the essentials: weapons, ammunition, a few provisions. The horses would have to be left behind. The passages following the underground stream would be too narrow for them to navigate. "I'm sorry, old friend," Mason murmured, giving his gelding a final pat. "With luck, you'll find your way out once we're gone." Rebecca led them to a narrow fissure in the rear wall of the chamber, barely visible in the dim light. "The stream flows through here," she explained. "The passage widens after the first 100 yards or so." One by one, they squeezed through the opening, Mason taking the rear position. The passage beyond was indeed narrow, forcing them to wade through ankle-deep water that was numbingly cold. The only light came from Gabriel's torch, its flickering glow barely sufficient to illuminate the path ahead. They moved as quickly as the treacherous footing would allow, aware that every minute might be the difference between escape and capture. The sound of their pursuers faded behind them as they penetrated deeper into the mountain's heart. The passage gradually widened the ceiling, rising until they could stand upright without difficulty. The stream they followed grew as well, fed by smaller tributaries that emerged from cracks in the walls. Soon they were wading through water that reached mid-calf, its current gentle but persistent. "How much farther?" Mason asked, his voice hushed despite the distance they'd put between themselves and Parker's men. "I'm not sure," Rebecca admitted. "I've only followed this route once, and that was in drier weather. The water level's higher now." It was not a reassuring answer, but they pressed on, having committed to this course. The passage continued to widen, the stream deepening as they progressed. In places, the ceiling dipped so low they had to duck to avoid stalactites that hung like stone daggers above their heads. Sarah stumbled once, the current nearly pulling her under, before Mason caught her arm, steadying her. "Careful," he murmured. "Stay close to the wall where the footing's better." She nodded, gripping his hand for a moment longer than necessary, seeking reassurance as much as support. Mason gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before releasing her. They had been following the underground stream for what felt like hours when Gabriel, in the lead, suddenly halted. "The passage divides here," he called back, holding the torch higher to illuminate a fork in their path. "The water flows both ways." Rebecca frowned, trying to orient herself. "I don't remember this. The last time there was only one channel." "The spring runoff must have opened a new passage," Gabriel suggested. "Which way do we go?" It was an impossible choice with potentially fatal consequences if they chose wrong. Mason studied the two branches, looking for any clue that might guide their decision. Both appeared similar, dark, water-filled tunnels extending into the unknown depths of the mountain. "Listen," Sarah said, suddenly, her head tilted to one side. "The left passage, the water sounds different there." They fell silent, straining to hear what Sarah had detected. After a moment, Mason caught a subtle difference in the sound of flowing water. The left passage carried a faint echo, suggesting a larger space ahead. "She's right," he said. "Left it is." They continued their journey, the water gradually deepening until it reached their waists in places. The cold was becoming a genuine concern. Too long in these conditions, and hypothermia would be as much a threat as Blackwood's men. Just as Mason was beginning to fear they had made the wrong choice, after all, the passage abruptly widened into a vast underground chamber. Their torch illuminated only a fraction of the space, but the echoing sound of falling water suggested they had found what they sought, the place where the underground stream emerged from the mountain. "There!" Gabriel pointed to a distant glimmer of light, daylight filtering through an opening in the chamber's far wall. "The way out." They moved toward it with renewed energy, hope lending strength to tired limbs. As they drew closer, the nature of the exit became clear. A jagged opening where the stream had carved its way through the mountain's flank, emerging as a waterfall that cascaded down the southern face of Widow's Peak. The gap was wide enough to pass through, but beyond it was a sheer drop of at least 30 feet to a pool below. The waterfall itself was not large, but sufficient to make climbing down its face a dangerous proposition. "Now what?" Sarah asked, peering cautiously over the edge. Mason surveyed their surroundings, looking for alternatives. The chamber they stood in appeared to be part of an old lava tube, its walls smooth and steep. The only exit was the opening before them, with its daunting drop. "We'll have to jump," he decided. The pool below looks deep enough to break our fall. Jump, Rebecca echoed, her face pale in the torchlight. Mason, that's at least 30 feet. If the water isn't deep enough. It's deep, Gabriel interrupted, having moved to the very edge to get a better view. I can see where the current has carved out the rock beneath, and there's a sandy bank just beyond the pool where we can climb out. Mason nodded. I'll go first. If it's safe, you follow one at a time. Before anyone could object, he handed his rifle to Gabriel, took a deep breath, and leapt through the opening. The fall seemed to last forever, the roar of the waterfall filling his ears as air rushed past. Then impact, cold water enveloping him, the shock of it driving the breath from his lungs. For a moment he was disoriented, unsure which way was up. Then his boots touched bottom briefly, and he kicked hard, propelling himself toward the surface. He broke through with a gasp, treading water, as he looked up at the anxious faces peering down from above. It's safe, he called. Aim for the center of the pool. Gabriel went next, Mason's rifle secured across his back. He entered the water with barely a splash, surfacing quickly and swimming to join Mason. Together they positioned themselves to assist the others. Sarah followed, her small form silhouetted against the opening before she jumped. She hit the water cleanly, but came up sputtering, clearly unused to swimming. Mason was at her side, instantly supporting her until she found her rhythm. You all right? He asked. She nodded, wiping water from her eyes. Just surprised. It's deeper than it looks. Rebecca was last, her hesitation evident even from below. Finally, with visible effort, she stepped off the edge, her body stiff with fear as she fell. Her entry was less controlled than the others, and for a heart-stopping moment, she didn't resurface. Mason was already swimming toward the spot where she'd gone under when she broke the surface, coughing and gasping but alive. He reached her side, offering support as she regained her breath. I've never learned to swim properly, she admitted between coughs. Thomas always said it wasn't a skill a rancher's wife needed. You did fine, Mason assured her, helping her toward the sandy bank Gabriel had spotted. They dragged themselves from the pool, waterlogged and shivering, but uninjured. The southern slope of Widow's Peak spread before them, a steep descent covered in pine forest that eventually gave way to the gentler terrain of the foothills. In the late afternoon light, they could see for miles a vista of mountains and valleys stretching toward the distant horizon. We made it, Sarah said, wonder in her voice as she wrung water from her hair. Part of the way, Mason tempered, not wanting to dampen her spirits, but mindful of the dangers still facing them. We need to keep moving, find shelter before dark. Gabriel was scanning the slope below them, his expression thoughtful. The old mining camp should be a few miles down near the tree line. We might find supplies there, maybe even horses if any of the buildings are still intact. It was their best option. With no time to waste, they began their descent following game trails that wound through the pine forest. The going was easier than their underground journey, but they were all feeling the effects of cold and exhaustion. Sarah particularly was flagging, though she made no complaint. Noticing her fatigue, Mason called a brief halt in a small clearing. Rest a few minutes, he instructed. Catch your breath. Sarah sank gratefully onto a fallen log, Rebecca joining her. Mason moved a short distance away, using the opportunity to check his rifle, which had mercifully remained dry thanks to Gabriel's care. Something's bothering me, Gabriel said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Just one thing, Mason replied dryly. Gabriel's expression remained serious. How did Parker find the cave entrance so quickly? Rebecca said it was well hidden. It was a question that had nagged at Mason as well. Maybe they got lucky, or maybe they had information we don't know about. Or maybe someone told them, Gabriel suggested, his voice dropping further. Mason studied him. You thinking of anyone in particular? Gabriel hesitated. I don't know, but someone knew we were heading for Widow's Peak. Someone knew about Rebecca's cabin. Someone like you, Chen, Mason said bluntly. A flash of anger crossed Gabriel's face. If I was working for Blackwood, why would I have warned you about his men in the first place? Why help you escape? It was a fair point, and one Mason had considered. To gain our trust, maybe. Lead us into a trap. If that was my plan, I've done a poor job of it, Gabriel pointed out. You're all still alive, and we're moving further from Blackwood's reach with every step. Mason had to concede the logic. If Gabriel was playing a double game, his actions made little sense. Then who, he pressed. Who else knew our destination? Gabriel's gaze drifted to where Rebecca and Sarah sat. I don't know, he said finally, but someone did. The implication hung in the air between them, uncomfortable but impossible to dismiss entirely. Mason had staked everything, his life, his future, Sarah's safety, on the belief that Rebecca Emerson was exactly who she appeared to be, a woman who had suffered at Blackwood's hands and escaped. But what if there was more to her story? He pushed the thought away. Now was not the time for doubts. They needed to reach safety first. Questions could come later. We should move, he said, rejoining the others. We've still got a few hours of daylight left. They continued their descent, the forest gradually thinning as they approached the tree line. Beyond it, they could make out the remains of the old mining camp, a cluster of weathered buildings that had once housed a thriving community during the silver boom years. Now it stood abandoned, a ghost town slowly reclaimed by the wilderness. As they drew closer, Mason signaled for caution. Gabriel and I will check it out first, he said. You two wait here. Rebecca nodded, putting an arm around Sarah's shoulders. The girl looked ready to protest but remained silent, perhaps too tired for argument. Mason and Gabriel approached the abandoned camp, carefully alert for any sign of occupation. The main street, little more than a wide path between ramshackle buildings, was deserted, dust and pine needles undisturbed except by the occasional animal track. Looks clear, Gabriel murmured as they moved from building to building, checking each in turn. No one's been here in months, maybe years. Most of the structures were in advanced stages of decay, their roofs partially collapsed, doors hanging from rusted hinges. The assayer's office still contained rusting equipment abandoned when the silver played out. The general store's shelves were bare, except for a few desiccated items too worthless to carry away. They were about to return for Rebecca and Sarah when Mason spotted something promising, a small stable at the camp's edge, its roof still largely intact. Let's check there, he suggested. Might be something useful. The stable's interior was dim but dry, the smell of old hay and horse still lingering after years of abandonment. To Mason's surprise, there were signs of more recent occupation, a bedroll in one corner, the ashes of a small fire in a cleared space on the stone floor. Someone's been using this place, he observed, kneeling to examine the ashes. Relatively recently. Gabriel had moved to a wooden chest against the far wall. Look at this, he called, lifting the lid to reveal an assortment of supplies, canned food, ammunition, even a few pieces of clothing. Someone's been stockpiling. Mason joined him, examining the contents. Prospector, maybe, or a trapper. Whoever it is, they're well prepared, Gabriel noted. There's enough here to last weeks. Mason was about to respond when a soft sound from outside caught his attention, a footfall too deliberate to be an animal. He signaled to Gabriel for silence, then moved cautiously toward the stable door, drawing his pistol. The figure that appeared in the doorway was silhouetted against the fading daylight, a rifle held ready but not aimed. That's far enough, strangers, a gruff voice announced. State your business or start praying. Mason held his position, keeping his pistol trained on the newcomer. We're just passing through, looking for shelter for the night. Passing through, eh? The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing a weathered face framed by a wild gray beard. The man was old, perhaps in his 70s, but his hands were steady on his rifle. Nobody passes through these mountains without good reason. You running from something or someone, both, Mason admitted, seeing no point in lying. We've got women with us, a mother and daughter. We're just looking for a safe place to rest before moving on. The old man studied them for a long moment, his rheumy eyes surprisingly sharp. Blackwood's men were through here 2 days ago, he said finally, asking questions, offering money for information. Mason tensed. What did you tell them? A bark of laughter. Told them to go to hell. Blackwood's the reason I'm living in this godforsaken place instead of enjoying my retirement in Helena. He lowered his rifle slightly. Name's Harlan Wilder. Used to own the largest freighting company in the territory until Blackwood decided he wanted a piece of it. Mason relaxed fractionally. Mason Reed, this is Gabriel Martinez. Harlan nodded to Gabriel, then returned his attention to Mason. Reed, I heard that name. You were a lawman once down in Coyote Creek. Word gets around, Mason observed. That it does. Harlan finally lowered his rifle completely. Where are these women you mentioned? Night's coming, and the temperature drops fast up here. Mason whistled a signal they had arranged earlier. Moments later, Rebecca and Sarah appeared at the stable entrance, their expressions wary. Harlan's eyebrows rose at the sight of them. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Rebecca Emerson, thought you were dead. Rebecca's face registered shock. Harlan, what are you doing here? Could ask you the same, the old man replied. Last I heard, you'd run off after Blackwood took over your spread. You two know each other? Mason asked, glancing between them. Rebecca nodded slowly. Harlan used to deliver supplies to our ranch back when... She trailed off, the memories evidently painful. Back when times were better, Harlan finished for her, before Blackwood got his hooks into Thomas. He turned his attention to Sarah, his gruff demeanor softening slightly. And this must be little Sarah. Not so little anymore, I reckon. Sarah studied him cautiously. I remember you, she said finally. You used to bring candy when you made deliveries. Peppermint sticks. A brief smile cracked Harlan's weathered face. Good memory, girl. He gestured toward the interior of the stable. Well, don't just stand there. Come in before you catch your death. Got a fire going in the old forge room. The forge room proved to be a small chamber adjoining the main stable where the blacksmith had once worked. A stone hearth still stood against one wall, a small fire burning cheerfully within it. Harlan had set up a simple camp bedroll, cooking equipment, a few personal items arranged with military precision. It's not much, he said as they gathered around the fire's warmth, but it's dry and defensible. One way in, one way out. Mason noted the strategic layout. Harlan had positioned his bedroll to give him a clear view of the entrance while remaining in shadow himself. The old man might have left civilization behind, but he hadn't forgotten its dangers. We appreciate the hospitality, Mason said. We won't impose long. Just need to rest, then we'll be on our way. Harlan snorted. On your way, where exactly? Blackwood's got men watching every trail off this mountain. Offered $100 for information about a man traveling with a woman and girl. He glanced at Gabriel. Didn't mention a Mexican, though. How many men? Gabriel asked. Dozen, maybe more. Well armed. Harlan busied himself preparing a pot of coffee on the edge of the hearth. Whatever you folks did to rile Blackwood, he's taking it personal. He took my daughter, Rebecca said quietly. Tried to claim her as property. Mason stopped him. Harlan nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Sounds like Blackwood. Man's got no bottom to his meanness. He poured coffee into tin cups, passing them around. So what's your plan? Keep running. It was the question Mason had been avoiding since they'd left Lone Pine. What was their plan? Where could they go that Blackwood's influence wouldn't reach? We need to get to the territorial capital, he said, thinking aloud. Find a judge who isn't in Blackwood's pocket. Present evidence of his crimes. Evidence, Harlan echoed skeptically. What evidence? Man like Blackwood doesn't leave paper trails. He leaves witnesses, Gabriel interjected. People whose lives he's destroyed. If enough of them came forward together, most are too scared, Rebecca pointed out, and with good reason. Sarah, who had been listening silently, suddenly spoke up. What about the deed? All eyes turned to her. What deed, Sarah? Mason asked gently. The one Pa found, in Blackwood's safe. She glanced at her mother. Remember, Pa came home all excited one night, saying he had something that would bring Blackwood down. Then the next day, Blackwood's men came and... She trailed off, the memory evidently painful. Rebecca's face had gone pale. I remember, she whispered. Thomas said he'd found proof that Blackwood had forged land deeds, claims to properties that weren't rightfully his. Including yours, Mason pressed. She nodded slowly. And others? The Martinez homestead, the Sullivan place, half a dozen more. Gabriel leaned forward, intensity in his dark eyes. Where is this deed now? I don't know, Rebecca admitted. Thomas hid it before Blackwood's men came. He never told me where. He told me, Sarah said quietly. Everyone stared at her in shock. The night before the card game. Sarah continued, her voice small but steady. Pa was drunk, crying. He kept saying he was sorry that he'd failed us all. Then he told me about a hiding place beneath the floorboards in the old barn. Said if anything happened to him, I should look there. And did you? Mason asked. Sarah shook her head. There wasn't time. The next day he lost me to Blackwood in that game. And then you came along. She looked at Mason, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I never got the chance. The implications hung heavy in the air. If Thomas Emerson had indeed hidden evidence of Blackwood's criminal activities, evidence that could potentially strip him of his ill-gotten properties and influence it, explain the man's obsessive pursuit of Sarah and her mother. It wasn't just about wounded pride or asserting ownership. It was about self-preservation. If the deed still exists, Mason said slowly, and if we could retrieve it, that's a lot of ifs, Harlan observed. It exists, Sarah insisted. Pa wouldn't have lied about that. Mason studied her face, saw the certainty there. I believe you, he said, but getting to it won't be easy. Blackwood will have men watching your old homestead. Not just watching, Gabriel added grimly. After Thomas disappeared, Blackwood claimed the property for unpaid debts. He's been using it as a relay station for his cattle operations. Rebecca's expression hardened. So he's living in our home now. After everything he's taken from us. Not living, Gabriel clarified. Just using the buildings. The main ranch house has been empty since Thomas left. A plan was beginning to form in Mason's mind, dangerous, possibly foolhardy, but potentially their only chance. If the deed is still there, he said, hidden where Thomas said we might be able to retrieve it. And then what? Harlan asked. You think a piece of paper is going to stop Blackwood? Man's got judges and politicians in his pocket all across the territory. Not all of them, Mason countered. Judge Harrington in Helena is known for his integrity. If we could get the evidence to him, you'd still have to survive long enough to reach Helena, Harlan pointed out, and Blackwood isn't likely to let that happen. The old man's pragmatism was a sobering reminder of the odds against them. But looking at Sarah and Rebecca finally reunited after years of suffering, Mason knew he couldn't simply accept defeat. We have to try, he said firmly. Otherwise, we'll be running for the rest of our lives. Gabriel nodded slowly. I agree, but we need more than just the four of us. 5, Harlan corrected, surprising them all. I've got my own score to settle with Blackwood. Been waiting years for a chance to hit back at him where it hurts. Mason studied the old man, reassessing him. Despite his age and apparent hermit lifestyle, there was a steely determination in Harlan's eyes that suggested he'd be a valuable ally. We'll need more than 5, Rebecca said thoughtfully, but maybe not as many as you think. She turned to Gabriel. You said Blackwood claimed our land after Thomas disappeared. What happened to the other properties he took? The Martinez place, the Sullivan homestead? Gabriel frowned. Most sit empty. Blackwood doesn't have the manpower to work all the land he's seized. He just wants to control it. So the buildings are still there, Rebecca pressed, including the people who lived in them once. Understanding dawned on Mason's face. You're suggesting we rally the people Blackwood has displaced. Use their knowledge of the land to our advantage. Rebecca nodded. Many of them are still in the territory. Some work for other ranchers. Some drifted to the mining camps or the railroad. But they all have reason to want Blackwood brought to justice. It could work, Gabriel said slowly. My father and brothers would join us. So would the Sullivans, I think, and others. It's still a long shot, Harlan cautioned. Even with more numbers, Blackwood has resources we can't match. We don't need to match him, Mason countered. We just need to get that deed and deliver it to Judge Harrington. Once the evidence is in official hands, Blackwood's influence won't matter as much. The discussion continued late into the night. The 5 of them huddled around Harlan's fire, weighing options and risks. By the time they settled on a plan, the moon had risen high above the mountains, casting silver light through the stable's single window. The plan was audacious, fraught with danger, but it offered their best chance at not just escaping Blackwood's reach, but ending his reign of terror once and for all. Mason would lead a small group himself, Gabriel and Harlan, to the Emerson homestead to retrieve the hidden deed. Meanwhile, Rebecca would activate a network of Blackwood's former victims, gathering them at a predetermined location to serve as both witness and protection when the evidence was finally presented to Judge Harrington. Sarah, much to her vocal displeasure, would remain hidden in the mountains with an elderly couple Harlan knew and trusted, former prospectors who had built a secluded cabin far from Blackwood's usual patrol routes. I should be with you, she protested when this last part was decided. It's my family's home. I know every inch of it. Which is precisely why Blackwood will be expecting you there, Mason explained gently. You're safer away from the action. I'm tired of being safe, Sarah retorted, a flash of the fire he'd first seen in her eyes at Coyote Creek. I want to help. Rebecca took her daughter's hand. You will help Sarah by staying alive, by being there when this is finished. Her voice softened. I've lost you once already. I can't bear to lose you again. The raw emotion in her mother's plea seemed to reach Sarah where logical arguments had failed. She nodded reluctantly, though the set of her jaw suggested the discussion wasn't permanently closed. As the others bedded down for the night, Mason took first watch, positioning himself near the stable's entrance, where he could observe the approach to the mining camp. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Montana sky. In the distance, an owl called its lonely cry, echoing across the mountainside. He thought of Elizabeth and Michael buried beneath a lone pine on the ridge above his ranch. What would Elizabeth think of the path he'd chosen, of the risks he was taking for people who had been strangers just days ago? She would understand, he decided. Elizabeth had always seen the connections between people, the invisible threads that bound even strangers together in a common humanity. She would have recognized in Sarah the same spark of life and determination that had drawn Mason to her in the first place. And in Rebecca, she would have seen a mother's fierce love, the same love she had borne for Michael. Perhaps that was why he had intervened that day in Coyote Creek. Not just because it was right, but because in saving Sarah, he had found a way to honor the memory of his own family, to prove that not everything good in the world had died with them. Movement beside him interrupted his thoughts. Sarah had risen from her bedroll and now stood at his side, her small form silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the doorway. Couldn't sleep, he asked quietly. She shook her head. Too much thinking. Mason nodded, understanding. It's been a long few days. Longest of my life, she agreed, settling beside him on an upturned bucket. And the best in a way, finding Ma alive. I still can't quite believe it. She never stopped thinking about you, Mason said. Never stopped looking for a way back to you. Sarah was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. I was angry at first, she'd admitted, when I thought she'd left me. Then Pa said she was dead and I was sad instead. Now, she struggled to find the words. Now I don't know what to feel. That's natural, Mason assured her. It takes time to sort through feelings like that. What about you, she asked suddenly. What do you feel about all this, I mean? The direct question caught him off guard. What did he feel? Relief that Sarah was reunited with her mother. Determination to see Blackwood Bar brought to justice. And something else, something he was reluctant to name, even to himself, a sense of purpose he'd thought lost forever. I feel, he began, then paused, seeking honesty. I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, doing what needs doing. Sarah considered this, then nodded as though it confirmed something she'd already suspected. When this is over, she said, when Blackwood is finished, what then? It was the second time that night someone had asked him about the future, a future he'd stopped considering years ago, when Elizabeth and Michael died. I don't know, he answered truthfully. Go back to Lone Pine, I suppose. Rebuild what was burned. Alone, the simple question carried weight far beyond its single word. Mason glanced at Sarah, saw the concern in her young face. Concern for him, he realized with surprise. I've been alone a long time, he said gently. I'm used to it. Doesn't mean you have to stay that way, Sarah pointed out with the forthright wisdom of youth. Ma likes you, I can tell. Heat rose in Mason's face, unexpected and unfamiliar. Sarah, I like you too, she continued, oblivious to his discomfort. You're a good man, Mason Reed, the kind Pa used to be before. She trailed off, the comparison perhaps too painful to complete. Mason found himself at a loss for words, moved by the child's simple assessment. Finally, he managed, thank you, Sarah. That means a great deal coming from you. She smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her serious face, making her look her age for once. You should get some sleep, she said, echoing his own frequent advice to her. I'll wake you if anything happens. I'm supposed to be on watch, he reminded her. We can watch together, she suggested. I'm not tired anyway. Mason relented, recognizing the stubbornness in her expression. Together they sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them, the stars wheeling slowly overhead in their eternal dance. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. The path ahead was fraught with risk. But in this moment, watching over this remarkable child who had somehow worked her way into his heart, Mason Reed felt something he had not experienced in years: hope. Not just for Sarah and Rebecca, or for the justice they sought, but for himself. For the possibility that life might yet hold more than memories and regrets. That even from the ashes of devastation, something new could grow. Dawn would come soon enough with all its attendant perils. But for now, in this quiet moment between darkness and light, Mason allowed himself to imagine a future beyond Blackwood's shadow. A future with purpose, with connection, perhaps even with family. Sarah's head gradually drooped against his shoulder as tiredness finally overcame her determination to stay awake. Mason didn't move, letting her rest. Her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, her face peaceful in repose, the wariness that normally guarded her features temporarily set aside. In protecting her, he realized he had found a way to protect himself as well from the isolation that had threatened to consume him after Elizabeth and Michael died. From the bitter emptiness that had replaced his sense of purpose when he turned in his badge. Whatever came next, whether they succeeded in their dangerous plan or failed in the attempt, Mason knew he would never again be the solitary figure who had rescued Sarah from that post in Coyote Creek. She had changed him, as had Rebecca, Gabrielle, and even gruff old Harlan. Reminded him that connections between people were not just liabilities that led to pain, but lifelines that made the pain bearable. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Mason made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, would ensure that Sarah and Rebecca found the justice and peace they deserved, and then perhaps he would allow himself to consider what came after. Not just survival, but living. Not just remembering the past, but building a future. Not just carrying his grief like a talisman, but opening himself to the possibility of joy. It was a frightening prospect in its way, more frightening than facing Blackwood and his men. But as Sarah stirred against his shoulder, murmuring something in her sleep, Mason knew it was a fear worth confronting. For her, for Rebecca, for himself, and for Elizabeth and Michael, who would have wanted him to live fully in their absence, not merely exist. The first rays of sunlight crept through the stable door, touching Sarah's face with gold. A new day, a new chance. Mason Reed, once broken by loss, found himself ready to take it.